On the Halloween morning of 1975 in Connecticut, a young girl would be found brutally bludgeoned to death just outside her own home. Hello, true crimerers. This is the Halloween case of Martha Moxley. Viewer discretion is advised. Martha Elizabeth Moxley was born on August 16th, 1960 in Piedmont, California. But by 1974, her family, which consisted of her parents and her older brother John, would move out to the Belle Haven neighborhood of Greenwich, Connecticut. This was considered like an upper-class neighborhood, so a lot of socialites kind of lived there. A lot of very wealthy families lived in this neighborhood. Her parents, especially her dad, were basically in the in crowd, if you will. And, they were just doing very well for themselves financially. And they were just a well-respected family in general. Her father, John David, had been director of the New York Public Library. He had also been director of the New York City Opera. And he was the chairman of the Board of Trustees for the Manhattanville College. Martha was described as like a really easygoing student. She could really get along with anyone. She made friends really easy. It took absolutely no effort for her to make a new friend, and she liked to be inclusive of everybody. She was a shining star academically. She typically got straight A's. She also played basketball, so she was very athletic. And at one point in school, she was voted as having the best personality. Even when they moved from a whole new state, right, she still was able to make friends like that, and she developed a large group of friends pretty quickly. Martha was not one to ever cause drama. She never got involved in gossip. She was just a really, really good kid. The family where they lived would be just down the street from another very wealthy family, probably not a name you're familiar with, but the Skakel family. The Skakels had a blood connection to the Kennedy family. Yes, the Kennedys. So Rustin Skakel was the brother of Ethel Skakel. And Ethel, well, she was married to Robert F. Kennedy, who was the brother, of course, of John F. Kennedy. And, of course, if you know history, both of those Kennedy men would be assassinated. At any rate, Rustin Skakel would end up marrying Anne, and then the two of them would go on to have 7 kids together. This family, however, was not the Brady Bunch. They were not a family who, I guess, got along all the time. Chronic alcoholism ran through that family, and that included Rustin Skakel, and even some of the children would battle with alcoholism at a very young age. They were also considered a very devout and also very strict Catholic family, and they had some very scathing looks at like sexual intercourse. Anything to do with sex, they were like, no. Anne Skakel would end up dying of cancer in 1973, and then this hit Rustin pretty hard. He would eventually become more of an alcoholic. He would become a recluse, and he essentially neglected his kids. He left them alone in the house many, many times for long periods of times, and the kids would end up throwing parties and getting drunk, which would lead to their own alcoholism. And so yeah, this was like a very dysfunctional family, especially compared to, the Moxley family, who was very well-to-do, very connected, very put together well, and were just happy. But Martha Moxley would end up becoming friends with, in particular, a couple of the Skakel children, Tom and Michael Skakel. At the time of this story, Martha is 15 years old. I believe Michael is also 15 and Tom is 17. So they would hang out often amongst other friends that were in their circle. But it would get to a point where Martha began to feel kind of uncomfortable. She was kind of like, she felt awkward around these two guys. And she actually talked about them in her diary all the time. She never really voiced her issues or concerns about these two guys, but she always wrote about it. So one entry from September 12th, 1975, she wrote, "Dear Diary, me, Jackie, Michael, Tom, Hope, Maureen, and Andra went driving in Tom's car. I was practically sitting on Tom's lap, because I was only steering. He kept putting his hand on my knee, and then he wrapped his arm around me. He kept doing stuff like that." A few weeks later, on October 4th, 1975, she wrote, "Dear Diary, I went to a party with the Skakels, and Tom was being an ass." And then at another point, she wrote this, "Michael was so out of it. He was being a real asshole. He kept telling me that I was leading Tom on. Michael jumps to conclusions. I really have to stop going over there." And her gut feeling, her intuition, was correct. On the night of October 30th, 1975, there in Greenwich, Connecticut, they called this mischief night. So basically they would go around, this was the night before Halloween, they would go around and pull pranks. They would throw, they would TP houses, they would do shaving cream and spray it everywhere. They would just kind of be a bunch of dumbass kids running around the neighborhood, just doing, the typical pranks you would think for Halloween time. That night, Martha Moxley had gone out with some friends, and this included Michael and Tom. They were kind of just sort of there as well. Martha was expected home sometime around 11 p.m., but 11 p.m. came and 11 p.m. went. And then her mother grew concerned pretty quickly when, she realized Martha wasn't home. So she did a cursory check kind of around the house, around the neighborhood, and she just couldn't find Martha. She was knocking on neighbors' doors, has Martha been here? No. So then she started calling other neighbors to see if they had seen Martha, but no one said they saw her. And then the following morning, obviously panic is setting in because they haven't found her yet. One of Martha's friends would go to the house and tell Martha's mom. The friend would say, "I saw Martha last night with Tom Skakel sometime around 9:30 p.m. So the Moxley house was just 150 yards from the Skakel home. So it's something you can easily walk in no time. So Martha's mom went to the Skakel house. She knocked on the door. Michael answered. He said he had not seen Martha at all since 9-ish last night. And that was about it. That's all she got out of Michael. But unfortunately, a little bit later that day, Martha was found. On the afternoon of Halloween 1975, a friend of Martha's found her lying face down underneath a couple of pine trees on the Moxley property. This is a big property, by the way, and she was kind of far away from the front door, basically. But Martha was deceased. The 15-year-old girl had obviously been very, very badly beaten and bludgeoned to death. Lying next to her was a golf club, a metal golf club that was broken in pieces. She was struck so hard with so much force that this golf club literally broke apart and it created sharp edges. So Martha was also stabbed in the neck with one of the sharp ends of the golf club. Her pants and her underwear were also pulled all the way down to her ankles. So clearly it looked like the motive here was sexual. The coroner would determine in the autopsy that they actually could not determine if she was sexually assaulted or not. They can't say that she wasn't, but there was no evidence that she was. It did not take police long to ascertain where the golf club came from, because engraved on the club was the name Anne Skakel, the mother of the Skakel kids who lived next door. When police got to the Skakel home, they confirmed that the club set was missing one club, the 6-iron, and the 6-iron is what was used to bludgeon Martha to death. They had also learned that Tom was allegedly the last one to see Martha alive, so they spoke to him, and he told police, "I saw her around 9:30 p.m. that night, then I went into my home, and I watched a scene from the movie The French Connection, the big car chase scene, And then after that, I went into my room and I did a school project. Tom was given a polygraph test, and he passed it with flying colors. He did also technically have an alibi for at least part of that, what he said he did, because living at the house with the Skakels was a 23-year-old live-in tutor named Kenneth Littleton. So he was hired by Rustin Skakel to tutor all of the kids, but, as part of the payment, he would be able to live in the house. But he did confirm that, yes, I was up watching The French Connection on TV. It was the TV premiere of it. And yes, he was there watching the chase scene with me. Michael Skakel was also questioned. He claimed his alibi was that he was out and about on the town after 9-something p.m. With friends, just driving around in a car. An alibi for which police were never able to actually confirm or verify. But Tom and Michael were cleared as suspects. What it appeared to the public was that the police did not want to take on this juggernaut of a family. The Skakels, who are very much connected to the Kennedys, very influential people, could, probably cause issues in the police if their family's being investigated for a murder. So, yeah, it just appeared that the police just didn't want to, we don't want to go near this. Rustin Skakel eventually said, "We are not cooperating with police anymore. My sons will not be answering any more questions. They will not be cooperating with police anymore." And then he said, "I am not allowing police to have access to their school records, their medical records, or anything. All of it's private. You can't see it." So, because of the lack of cooperation and the lack of really anything, police didn't really have anything to go on. A year would go by, and by 1976, police would sort of begin to turn their accusations towards the 23-year-old live-in tutor of the Skakels, Kenneth Littleton. Police had found out that since 1975, Kenneth had been fired by the Skakel family because basically most of the kids ended up failing. So he was fired and he no longer got to live there. But the murder weapon coming from directly inside the Skakel home means someone in that house had to have done this. So, well, who's next? Kenneth, of course, because Rustin wasn't home. They confirmed he wasn't home. This 23-year-old tutor of kids, he probably had a thing for kids, right? Of course they would probably think that. They gave him polygraph test after polygraph test after polygraph test. They were trying to really publicly hone in on this guy being the suspect and really kind of ruining his life. And he passed every polygraph test they gave, and they had no physical evidence to connect him to the murder, no more than they had to connect to the Skakel brothers. So eventually they cleared him as a suspect, but he would tell them something kind of big. A few weeks after Martha's murder, Kenneth was walking kind of on the property of the Skakel home, and he saw a chipmunk that had been beaten to death and had been pinned to the ground with teas. Lying next to the chipmunk was a golf club from the golf club collection from Martha's murder, basically. And Michael was there at the time, and so Kenneth asked him, "Did you do this?" Michael looked at him coldly and said, "Of course it was me. Who else would have done it?" So, given the similarities of this dead chipmunk to the murdered Martha Moxley, Kenneth is like, I'm pretty sure he killed the Moxley girl. But police were still like, nah. He even told them, listen, even as a 15-year-old kid back then, he was a mean piece of shit, and he was an alcoholic who had erratic behavior. So, but still, police were just like, nope, no, we've cleared him, he's good. So, Kenneth Littleton was never charged, and he was never arrested for the murder. So, the case just went cold, and went cold for quite some time. They were finally able to reopen it in 1991 when some, really random rumor came about that one of the Kennedys had something to do with the murder, but this was just a complete lie. But the good news is that sparked attention back into this case. So, Rustin Skakel, the father, he had hired 2 private investigators to look into this murder because he just wanted to clear the Skakel name. He wanted his 2 sons to be just eliminated from, everyone's thoughts that they did this. But that would end up biting him in the ass. These 2 investigators that were hired by Papa Skakel, they interviewed both Tom and Michael and found out that both men blatantly lied about their alibis for the night of October 30th, 1975. Tom had said at one point that night, sometime after 9 p.m., and again, this is just what he said. I feel like this isn't true, but he said that he and Martha had sat down in the yard and pleasured themselves just sort of together. Again, that's just what he said. Then he said after that he didn't see her. Now, Michael had said he was out and about on the town and in a car, but then he would tell later on in 1991 or so, well, okay, maybe that wasn't totally accurate. I mean, I did do that, but then also at one point that night, I had maybe climbed a tree just outside of Martha's bedroom, and I peeped into her window, and from the tree, I pleasured myself while watching inside her room. Yuck. Fucking yuck. The investigators would then interview former friends and old classmates of the Skakel brothers, especially pertaining to Michael, because they're really kind of trying to they really feel like Michael is the issue here. So they interviewed one friend of Michael, or previous classmate, and the friend said that Michael told him this, quote, he said, "I am going to get away with murder because I am a Kennedy." End quote. This witness also would go on to say that Michael said this, quote, "I made advances towards Martha that night, but she would not comply. So I drove in her skull." End quote. In 1997, Michael Skakel recorded some stories that he was going to give to an author who was writing an autobiography for Michael Skakel. And on one of these tapes, Michael can be heard saying this, quote, "The night of Moxley's murder, I was drunk, and I was high on marijuana, and I was sexually aroused." End quote. And also, gross. So, by 2000, Michael Skakel would be arrested and charged with the murder of Martha Moxley. He had access to the murder weapon. It was in his home. He was infatuated with Martha. Martha rejected him. Martha was uncomfortable around him. He implicated himself on audio of committing the crime. He had confessed to multiple people that he killed her. He lied about where he was that night. He lied about seeing Martha after 9 p.m. that night. So he would go to trial. And on June 7th, 2002, Michael Skakel was found guilty of the murder of Martha Moxley, and he was sentenced to just 20 years in prison. Many people, including the higher echelon of people, believed then and still believe that Michael is completely innocent, that the entire Skakel family is innocent in all of this. Are they? In 2013, Michael Skakel successfully won an appeal, and his conviction was overturned completely. This was because he got inadequate representation by his defense counsel during trial. But then, in 2016, the state Supreme Court would overturn his overturned conviction, so he was going back. But in 2018, that same court would reverse the reversal, and he was free again. As of this video, October of 2022, Michael Skakel is still free. He is not charged with any crime. And at this point, the prosecution has decided not to prosecute him again. Most of the witnesses, or a lot of them, are now deceased because, they were old. And the world seems to be against them in general. So The Moxley family believes, and I completely agree, that Michael Skakel killed Martha. I mean, yeah, obviously. If it wasn't Michael, it was Tom. It was like one of those two. There's just no question. Like, it seems ridiculous that he's still out there. The Moxley family, and I agree with this too, believes that because of the Skakels' powerful connections, especially within politics, is the sole reason why their daughter's killer is roaming free. And that's 100% correct. It's because of who they know and how much money they had, and you get to walk away from murder, I guess. It's just frustrating because the people who are supposed to care about this 15-year-old girl getting justice doesn't seem to care anymore. They're just like, well, we've lost. They're too powerful. We can't beat them. On to the next, you know? And I know it's a long, long time ago, but I don't care how long ago it was. She deserves her justice. The man served almost no time in prison for a brutal murder. And who knows, he may have sexually assaulted her, but there was no proof of it. But, sorry, this stuff makes me angry so much. One was killed inside of a gas station. The other killed after a Halloween party. Hello, true crimeers. These are two unsolved Halloween murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Number 1, the case of Norton Gregory. So this case takes us way back in the Wayback Machine, all the way to the 1950s, specifically 1957 near Kirkland, Washington. I unfortunately cannot find a photo of the victim in this case. There's actually virtually no photos for this case. That's obviously given how old of a case it is. But back in 1957, Kirkland, Washington was just considered a really quiet place to live, peaceful, serene. There really wasn't a whole lot going on. It was not as developed as it is nowadays. But back in 1952, a man named Norton Gregory, who was married and had 6 kids, he opened up his own gas station. And the gas station was maybe half a mile away from where he and his family lived. But it was his way of supporting his family, and they did pretty good. There was a lot of mouths to feed, so business needed to be good in order to pay for all of it. I don't really have much information on Norton as a person. There's like no obituary for him or anything like that. One of Norton's regular customers was a woman named Mrs. O'Farrell. And on Halloween 1957, Mrs. O'Farrell entered the gas station. She was expecting to see Norton. She did, just not in the way anyone would ever think. Norton was lying on the floor of the gas station, and he was in a humongous pool of blood. And she could tell that, unbelievably, Norton was still breathing. Whatever had happened to him, he was motionless, but he was breathing. So she reaches out to the authorities immediately, and they send an ambulance and police over there. And Norton, who they confirmed was still alive, was rushed to the nearest hospital. But unfortunately, he would not survive. And this is because Norton had been shot 5 times, all in his head. 3 of them were at very close range. And it's really unbelievable that he even survived 1 or 2 of those shots, let alone 5, clinging on to life for at least another 30, 40 minutes. Like, I can't even imagine the pain and the agony one would be in that situation. In terms of the investigation as to who did this, obviously this is way back in 1957. They didn't have CCTV cameras back then. They didn't have any cameras of that nature. They did dust for fingerprints, like shoe impressions and stuff like that, but this is a relatively busy convenience store / gas station that sees a lot of traffic. And if you find fingerprints, it doesn't mean anything because of how many people go in and out. When you have murders that happen in settings like this, it is really difficult to discern one fingerprint from the next in terms of one belonging to the killer, one not. Unless the murder weapon was left behind with fingerprints on it, or maybe the cash register, but that wasn't the case in this story. The most common and likely theory is that this was some form of botched robbery attempt. That perhaps Norton was somewhere in the back of the store when somebody walked in and noticed that no one was at the register and so tried to steal money when Norton walked in on them, and then the guy reacted, or girl reacted, by shooting him. But the thing is that there were 3 shots fired at close range, meaning the killer was right next to him. And sometimes you would look at that and go, that's personal. That's overkill. Shooting him 5 times in his head, that's unnecessary. Like 1 or 2 shots would have been it. In terms of if money was missing from the cash register, I'm not 100% sure. Norton also apparently had some gambling issues, and he had some gambling debts. And there was a theory that this was possibly someone retaliating from Norton not paying off his debt. However, that has never been corroborated by anyone. They couldn't find anything tangible with that lead. And so really the only true theory here is that this was some type of robbery that went very wrong. But given how personal the shooting was it someone that Norton knew and knew well? That's certainly a possibility. Or maybe this burglar walked in while Norton was at the register and said, hey, open the cash register, and Norton maybe wasn't complying, and so he lifted the gun and shot him a few times in his head. That could explain why it was done at such close range. What kind of shocked the community at first was that several weeks after the murder happened, his wife Helen would reopen the gas station, and she also ended up dating a sheriff's deputy who she later would marry. I think there were people in the community who saw that as being kind of odd or suspicious, like how would she even dream of opening that store so soon, and how could she marry, a sheriff's deputy just after she lost her husband? But you also have to think, especially back then, she had 6 kids. She needed to survive. She needed her kids to be fed. And so opening the store was a necessity. She had to. She may not have wanted to, but she needed it. And she eventually fell back in love with somebody else and got married because, again, you need to be able to take care of all these kids. And so I don't really look at it as necessarily a sign of guilt. I just look at it as a sign of, I'm a wife who just lost my husband. I have 6 kids to feed, so I need to do something. In 1958, there was a local teenager who would end up confessing that he killed Norton Gregory. And he told them that the murder weapon I used, the gun, could be found under a particular bridge. So police go to that bridge, they search everywhere, they don't find the gun. They don't find anything. And as they look further into this teenager, they found out that he was actually a patient at Western State Hospital, and he was there and checked in, admitted on the day and night of the murder. And really, there's been no more updates since then. This case, it just went cold, and nobody seems to talk about it. There's really virtually no coverage of this story. Somebody walked in and murdered Norton brutally. Shot him 5 times. For what? What was the motive? Was it someone he knew? Was it a complete stranger? Was it related to a gambling debt? It's never been solved. It's never been found out. And with this happening in the late 50s, this is now 67 years later. That's if a killer was in their 20s, sure, they could still be alive. If it was a teenager, they could still be alive. But if they were like someone in their 30s, maybe 40s, they're dead. But the killer could potentially still be alive, but would definitely be an elderly person at this point. And at this point, most of his direct family members back then are also gone. And so you look at stories like this and is like, are they really ever going to care, because everyone who was a part of his life is likely gone? His kids are probably still alive. And so there are some people left there to get some kind of justice. Even if it's just an answer, that would be something nice to have, some form of closure, even if it's a little bit, something. And it's still possible that someone somewhere out there might know the truth. And if you do know the truth, you need to reach out to the Kirkland Police Department and just give them the information you have. The killer is more than likely gone, and true justice may never actually happen, but there is still a slight possibility. But hopefully, the Halloween murder of Norton Gregory will not remain an unsolved mystery forever. Number 2, Arpana Janaga. This case did happen much more recently, back in 2008. And this also happened in Washington, in Redmond, Washington. Arpana Janaga at the time of this case was 24 years old. She was a graduate from Rutgers and she was a software engineer. Arpana loved motorcycles, she loved taekwondo. She actually volunteered at the fire department and also at the local animal shelters. She was someone who was really enthusiastic about life. She was well loved. She had a huge group of friends, very popular, and really no one could say anything bad about her. She was someone who liked to have fun. She liked to party, as do most young people in their 20s. So it was Halloween 2008. Arpana was hosting or co-hosting a Halloween party at their apartment complex. And this was going to be on multiple different levels of the apartment building. There was going to be like kind of the party kind of go anywhere. And by everyone's accounts, it was a popular little party. There was a lot of people there. She was having a very good time. She seemed to be in great spirits. There wasn't any noticed altercations with her, but the last time anyone can actually recall seeing Arpana was around 3 o'clock in the morning when she left the party on a lower level and went up to her apartment on the 3rd floor. Her neighbors would later report that they heard muffled moaning sounds coming from her apartment, but it was Halloween night, there was a party, there was lots of drinking, and they just thought, no, this was just Arpana having consensual sex with someone. But that was not the case. What the neighbors actually heard was likely Arpana being murdered. It was a few days after the party. Nobody had heard or seen from Arpana since the party. Her dad became really worried when he couldn't reach her, and no one in the family could reach her. The friends couldn't reach her. So one of her friends and then a neighbor at the apartment building would end up going to her apartment to check on her. When they got to her apartment, they know the door was closed, but they noticed that there was some kind of damage to it, that it looked like someone had forced that door open. When they walked in, they found Arpana on the floor of her bedroom, and she was dead. Arpana was beaten savagely. This was an extreme beating. She had a gag shoved down her throat, and she had duct tape around her mouth. So the coroner eventually will determine that her cause of death was blunt force trauma, strangulation, and also she had been sexually assaulted. The way she was strangled was with a piece of a shoelace that was pulled around her throat. They also noticed that there was an oily substance, like motor oil possibly, dumped all over her body. And the police said that's probably someone trying to hide their tracks, cover their tracks, trying to erase any trace of them on her body. The killer also took toilet bowl cleaner and put it all over Arpana's hands and nails, again, to try to destroy evidence. They noticed that the linens inside of her on her bed had been pulled off of her bed. The comforter from her bed was found in water in the bathtub, so someone had soaked it in water. Despite all these attempts for the killer to erase any trace of them, they did still find DNA evidence that was not Arpana's. The problem, though, is that the DNA evidence was from 3 separate people. The bootlace had skin cell DNA on it. And when they eventually discovered who that DNA belonged to, they were able to confirm that that person did have an alibi for the night of the murder. In terms of how his DNA was on that bootlace, I'm not 100% sure. He might have known her. Maybe they were his boots. I'm not sure. There was also trace DNA found on Arpana's neck, like skin cell DNA, and also the duct tape had DNA on it. This DNA matched a man. His name was Emmanuel Fair. Then they also collected a robe that had been soaked in Arpana's blood that was thrown into a trash can outside the apartment complex. That robe also had Emmanuel Fair's DNA on it. The third set of DNA matched Arpana's next door neighbor. But this was the neighbor who entered the apartment with the friend of Arpana, who then found the body. And so they know he was in the apartment at a certain point when the body was discovered. So it's possible this DNA came from some kind of interaction with that. But the thing his DNA was found on raised some eyebrows, because it was there was a bottle of motor oil that had been dumped all over Arpana, but his DNA was on that. He also had traces of DNA on that same robe that the other man's DNA was on. When police were looking into this neighbor, they found out that he was trying to delete calls from his phone, calls that he had made, but it wouldn't have mattered because checking her phone records, they actually found out that Arpana got a phone call. The last call she ever got that she answered was from this neighbor. Whenever he was asked to maybe cooperate with the investigation, he denied it. He was not cooperative. And he always basically said, "It wasn't me. I don't know. It's not me." And then eventually he flees to Canada. However, his DNA being found there could be explained by the fact that he had entered the apartment with somebody else. He may have touched the motor oil bottle unwillingly or unknowingly. Why did he call her? No one knows. But what about this other man, Emmanuel Fair? So Emmanuel Fair, because his DNA was found on the duct tape that was on her body, as well as the bloody robe, he was charged with the murder because that was more direct evidence that was tied directly to her body, that the duct tape had to have been put on her during the attack. And so that's more conclusive than, say, DNA being found in the motor oil bottle, or DNA being found on a shoelace that many people could have touched. And so he goes on trial, but that trial ends in a hung jury. And so they order a second trial. The second trial happens in 2019, and this time he's acquitted. During the second trial, they were able to flag down that neighbor who also his DNA was present at the scene, and he testified at trial. But here's the kicker. Every question they asked him, he pled the fifth. Pleading the fifth, pleading the fifth, pleading the fifth. They asked him a bunch of questions. He refused to answer any of them. Now, because the evidence of his DNA being at the crime scene on the motor oil bottle, it was not considered, like I said earlier, was not considered like concrete evidence of that person being involved directly with the murder. So they were not allowed to argue that perhaps maybe Emmanuel Fair and the neighbor committed this murder together. They could not do that because his DNA evidence was not as substantial, it was more circumstantial than it was for Emmanuel. And when he was acquitted, Emmanuel Fair, the jury was questioned, and one or two of the jury members would end up saying that we could not come to a conclusive, like, he's definitely guilty. They said there was a lot of doubt. You have to prove a person's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury didn't feel they did that because of the fact that they couldn't be sure if that neighbor had either been involved in the murder or if that neighbor committed the murder solely by himself. Because there was that extra DNA that was present, including that third person who had an alibi, so they knew this person wasn't the killer. But because of that other piece of DNA and that neighbor being really sketchy and fleeing to Canada and not answering questions, not cooperating with police, and then pleading the fifth on every question he's asked at trial, the jury's like, we can't say if it was him who did all of this, just him. Or we can't say if maybe he helped Emmanuel. So they had to acquit Emmanuel Fair. Why would Emmanuel Fair's DNA be on the duct tape? There could be other reasons other than committing the murder. And something that the jury did here was that because this was a Halloween party with multiple different levels, with multiple different apartments, people were in and out of all of these apartments. And that actually included Arpana's apartment at one point. So Emmanuel Fair was there that night, as well as the neighbor. And so he tried to explain, like, I was in her apartment along with about 50 other people throughout this night. You know, people were touching things. People were just sort of conversating and not realizing they were like, they were kind of not touching things or whatever. So it is very possible he could have touched the roll of duct tape in her apartment, and that's just how his DNA was on it. And then somebody else committed this murder, like the neighbor. And in terms of his alibi during when the murder would have happened, he said he was asleep in one of the apartments. He didn't live there. That was not where he lived, but he was invited there as a guest, and he had passed out. And there were 20 different phone calls made from his phone between like 1 something in the morning and 5 something in the morning, including 3 or 4 calls to the same person. He says he woke up and he was asleep on his phone. So he must have, likely, butt dialed, so to speak, a couple numbers. It's possible. His defense also argued that the evidence found on the robe was in a trash dumpster outside the apartments, and that dumpster had not been searched for like 2 or 3 days after the murder. So his DNA being present on the robe, there was too much time in between that it could have been easily contaminated by other things thrown into the dumpster on top of it. Because, they're drinking all that stuff, and things could have been cross-contaminated, and it was not exactly the most well-handled police investigation. It sounds like the evidence collecting wasn't exactly top-notch. And Emmanuel Fair was also the only black person at this Halloween party, as far as they could tell. And so they also felt there was some prejudice against him being considered the main suspect because of that. So there was just too much doubt with the physical evidence, and so the jury had to acquit him. Plus the fact that the neighbor was considered, in people's minds, considered a viable suspect, but was not really being treated as such. Okay, so I was curious as to why the neighbor wasn't really looked at or arrested in any way, shape, or form. So I'm finding it, I just found an article that stated that apparently he was offered immunity to testify in that second trial, which is strange because he pled the fifth in all of his questions. So I'm not sure if that immunity deal would have been flipped if he had confessed to being a part of it. I'm not sure. That's wild. Why would they offer him immunity? That's crazy. His DNA is at the crime scene, right? He made a phone call to her. Last call she ever took was from him. Why would they offer him immunity? That's insane. Anyway, sorry. I was curious. I was like, ugh. But at any rate, the murder of Arpana Janaga has now remained unsolved. Because Emmanuel Fair was acquitted, he cannot be tried again. Double jeopardy is in place. So if he did it, then he did it, and he got away with it. I think just given the fact that there were so many people in this apartment building, and there were people in and out of so many different apartments, including Arpana's apartment, and the fact that many people would testify that not only was Emmanuel at one point in her apartment with many other people, it's a very good chance he could have touched things, touched a robe, touched duct tape. And you can't sit there and say for sure that he's the killer when there are possibilities as to why his DNA was on certain things. It doesn't sound like they had like seminal fluid DNA or blood DNA, anything like that. It was really primarily, it seems like, touch DNA or hair stuff. And not like me looking at it kind of from the outside looking in, if I was on that jury, I don't think I could have been like, yeah, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no way I could have. Is it possible he was involved? Sure. But I couldn't sit here and say that he definitively was. That's just, I can't. And you would rather have a guilty person walking free than have an innocent person in prison. Given the fact that, for God's sakes, we just executed Marcellus Williams a few months or so ago. And there was the Robert Robertson case recently where, as of me filming this video, his execution was given a temporary stay just hours before his execution because it's very possible, very likely that he's innocent, and there's a very strong chance that Marcellus Williams was innocent. And so you don't want that. You don't want innocent people in prison. You certainly don't want innocent people being executed. So if Emmanuel Fair did this, that sucks that he's out there. But if he didn't do it, great. It's good that he's not in prison for it. I don't know. I have no idea. But the police there consider her case still open. It's an open investigation. Somebody somewhere out there might have answers, and perhaps that someone is you. If you do have any information about this murder, please reach out to the police in Redmond, Washington with any information you have. You can report your tips anonymously. You do not have to say who you are. You just have to say what you know. And so hopefully one day, Arpana Janaga will get the justice she rightfully deserves. They thought it was a Halloween prank. It was anything but. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Cornelius Hodges. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Cornelius Hodges is 30 years old and he is living in the North Omaha, Nebraska area. His parents were Kenneth and Diane Perry, and they had their own home, and then about 3 miles from their home is where Cornelius was living in his own apartment.
Cornelius has always been known as a fighter. When he was about 2 years old, he was diagnosed with a severe kidney disease in which one of his kidneys had to be removed. This would create developmental disabilities in him, but he always found a way to fight through it. His mom said that he was just an incredibly strong young man. He never gave up on anything, and she would say that Cornelius was their angel. He was their miracle child. By 2016, Cornelius is now a full-grown adult. He's 30 years old, and he is 6'3". He is, quite a large man, but always had this like gentle giant type persona to him. He was always considered a really friendly and outgoing person, and he didn't really seem to have any enemies, at least no enemies that anyone knew about, which makes what happened to him kind of just all that more surprising. The last time that Cornelius's parents can say they saw him was on the evening of October 24th, 2016. He had actually been spending the weekend with his mom at their house, which I guess was on 41st and Ohio Streets there in Omaha. That last evening, they had gone to a movie, they got some dinner, they laughed. It was just a really fun evening for them. At approximately 1 a.m., he decides to leave that house and walk towards his apartment, which was about 3 miles away. This was something he did all the time. Even at that late at night, it was a very frequent thing. He actually really loved to walk. He preferred walking. He did have his own car at one point, but he always just took to walking places. Sometimes he would use a bike instead of walking, but he was more about the active thing. His mom, Diane, fell asleep. She was expecting a phone call from him when he got home, but it sounds like she either fell asleep before that happened or she just kind of lost track of time. And so the following morning, she tries to call him, but he does not answer. She doesn't really think a whole lot of it. Obviously, Cornelius is an adult and he could just be busy with doing other things. She tries calling him later in the day, still nothing. And at this point, that motherly instinct kicks in where she thinks something feels off. And so she will drive down to his apartment. She knocks on the door, gets no response. She has a spare key and she lets herself in. And it was very clear that Cornelius had not been there at all. It really did look like he never even got to his apartment the night before. At that point, she goes to police to report her son missing. And then that same evening, his mom and his father, family, friends, they all begin to, not only are they calling around to people like, where can he be? But they're also literally on foot scouring the neighborhood. They're going from building to building, house to house. They're looking down all the streets. They walk the path that Cornelius would typically take. He always used the same route, and they weren't having any luck. About a week later, on October 30th, 2016, Diane is taking a break from looking and just taking, a little bit of time, and she's watching the news, and she sees something absolutely horrifying. A body was found near the backyard of somebody's house on Hamilton Street. The body was decomposed. And according to the person who lived at that house, I guess they looked at it and assumed that it was a Halloween prank, that someone had just put some, fake dummy or some kind of decoration in their yard. It's Halloween, of course, it's all over the place. There's decorations all over. And so thinking it was a prank, I guess they didn't really think much of it at first, but then when they begin to get closer to it, they realized that this was a human body. This was not a prank. This was not a decoration. This was a dead body. At that point, Cornelius's family rushes to that house that they saw on the news because they wanted to know if it was Cornelius. His mom had that feeling of that's got to be him. Has to be him. The coroner would be able to determine pretty quickly that the body was, in fact, that of Cornelius Hodges. Cornelius's cause of death was a gunshot wound. There was no gun found near him, and where he was shot, they determined immediately that this was not like a suicide or anything like that. This was a homicide. Somebody deliberately killed him. I don't know. There's one thing I'm kind of confused on, because based on the state of decomposition, it was pretty evident that Cornelius had been dead pretty much the entire time he was missing. So meaning that when he left his mom's house and was walking along Hamilton, he was accosted and killed. So he likely died the night he went missing. I'm confused on like how no one was the body there the whole time in that backyard and they just never went to the backyard to check. I mean, a lot of people don't go in their backyards every single day, so it's not completely unusual. Was he shot somewhere else and dumped there? Because it doesn't sound like anyone heard a gunshot that night. This was a neighborhood that's considered a really safe neighborhood and not one where they really have a lot of crime in. So that's just one part I'm kind of confused on how long was he in that backyard. But they basically grilled the owner of that house. He had no connections whatsoever to Cornelius or Cornelius's friends or family. And police say they really looked into this person and everyone who lives in that house. And they said that none of them were considered suspects or persons of interest. It just so happened to be their yard that this body was found. It sounds like the family believes that Cornelius was killed by someone who maybe had seen him on this walk home before, and they just don't know if it's someone he knew or if it was a stranger. Like, was this maybe someone trying to rob him? Was this a random thing that just they saw him and they killed him? It's really, really unclear. But he did that same walk all the time. And also usually at that time a lot, at that time of night. So it could be someone who did see him frequently and for whatever reason decided to kill him. But what that motive is completely unknown. They have 0 persons of interests. They have 0 suspects. They have absolutely no idea who did this and why. They have gotten some tips and some leads, but it's really been kind of far and few between. Like I said at the beginning, Cornelius didn't have any enemies. He usually kept to himself. He was a relatively kind of quiet, peaceful type personality. He didn't ruffle any feathers. He got along with everyone. There was no like jilted exes or anything like that. This was just a regular guy, a regular, really good guy who was just killed. And no one knows why. And this actually wasn't even the first time that someone in this family was murdered, because I guess a couple of years prior, Cornelius's older brother was also murdered. But from what I understand, there's no connection between these 2 murders. It's just 2 very unfortunate tragedies in this family. And so now the family and police, they just want to know what happened and they want justice to be done. Cornelius didn't deserve this. It could not have happened to a nicer guy, but someone, as of today, I'm filming this in 2024 in August, someone has gotten away with this murder. This was a murder, a homicide. Somebody out there deliberately made the decision to point a gun at Cornelius's body, pull the trigger, and killed him. And somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth. Because people who do these types of things, they love to talk. And maybe you're afraid to come forward because they'll retaliate against you. Well, you can always report your information anonymously. You never have to say who you are. You just have to say what you know. This family deserves that. They deserve those answers. They deserve that closure. They deserve that justice. So if you have any information about the murder of Cornelius Hodges, please call 402-444-5656. Or you can call Omaha Crime Stoppers at 402-444-STOP. There is currently a $25,000 reward for any information that helps capture his killer. So if you need to be motivated by money, there is money out there. But please, if you know anything, please report your information to the police so that Cornelius and his family can get the justice they all rightfully deserve. There is a very good chance that the state of Texas executed an innocent man for the murder of a nun on Halloween. Hello, true crimerers. This is the Halloween case of Sister Tadia Benz. Viewer discretion is advised. Tadia Benz was actually born in Switzerland in 1905. I don't really know much of anything about her, unfortunately, but I know at this point of the story she had moved to Amarillo, Texas, and she was a sister for the Catholic Church. She was a nun. Specifically, she was a nun at the St. Francis Convent in Amarillo, Texas. It was Halloween, but the morning of Halloween, kids had not gone out trick-or-treating yet. They had not put on their costumes yet. Bright and early, just as the day was getting started, a few of the nuns had entered the convent that morning, and they found that Sister Tadia Benz, who lived there at the convent, of course, her door was closed, which was unusual because typically they left their doors open. So they opened up her door and they found her on the floor next to her bed. Sister Benz was nude, and at first they didn't notice any signs of like foul play. They didn't see any blood at first, but when they kind of moved her onto her back, her face was completely bloody and she was absolutely deceased, and it was clear at that point that someone had killed her. She was actually sent to the funeral home directly, but they did still perform an autopsy, and they determined that she had a lot of injuries. She was sexually assaulted. They did discover that, and she was also beaten. Someone had hit her, probably with their fists, and she was also stabbed numerous times. And the other nuns contacted the Amarillo police. They arrived and they secured her bedroom, which was located on the second floor of the convent. They collected as much evidence as they could, including the sheets from the bed. They took the clothing that was found in the room near her. They found a knife under the bed with blood on it, so they assumed that this was probably the murder weapon. But you would think the beating and the stabbing was probably what led to her death, but it actually wasn't. Her cause of death was strangulation. So this poor woman was sexually assaulted, she was beaten, she was stabbed, and then she was strangled until she was dead. She was a 76-year-old woman. By the way, I can't remember if I told you the year this happened, but this was Halloween in 1981. So also at the autopsy, the coroner did find semen inside Sister Benz, but for some reason, because back in 1981, they didn't have the DNA testing that we know today, but they were able to at least take a sample and determine the blood type. But for some reason, they didn't run that test. But I believe they stored it, the sample. About an hour or so after the nuns found the body, they also saw in their community room that a window had been broken open, and that was located on the first floor. So they assumed that that was how this perpetrator entered. When police canvassed the area, they get witnesses, and across the street, I believe, from the convent was a neighborhood, and a witness stated they saw a young man running from the convent at some point in the very early morning hours, or possibly the night before. The witness who said they saw this person identified the individual as Johnny Frank Garrett, a 17-year-old kid who was kind of known to police in the area, and he lived across the street. When police go to his home to question him, they are allowed to go inside the house. They notice, they have a set of knives in this house, and there is a steak knife missing. And the knife that was found underneath Sister Benz's bed was a steak knife. And they concluded that it was the exact same steak knife that would have been a part of that collection, and there was that one missing knife. They also dusted that knife for fingerprints, and the fingerprints came back as to belonging to Johnny Frank Garrett. And here's the thing. Johnny admits that he was in the convent earlier that night, the night before. He actually stated to police that he busted out the window on the first floor and entered the convent, and he intended, I guess he stole a stereo. And that could explain why the knife was maybe left inside the convent somewhere. And maybe that's why it got dropped, and maybe someone else picked it up and used it to stab Sister Benz. It would explain why his fingerprints were on it. But then, according to police, they bring him into the actual police station to further question him. Because he's now basically he placed himself inside that convent around the time this nun is murdered. It's the knife from their house. It's got his fingerprints on it. And apparently, he, after some time, confesses to the murder. He stated that he broke in the way he said he broke in, with the intent of stealing something. He found his way into a nun's room on the second floor, and that's when he noticed there was actually someone sleeping in the bed. The nun woke up and startled him, and he startled her, and he said that she was going to scream, so he covered her mouth and choked her until she passed out. He then says he had sex with her, and then he left the convent the way he entered it. Now, the confession was not recorded on audio. A detective was basically transcribing the confession. The detective claims that this is what Johnny was saying. Johnny would later say that what actually happened in the room was the detective was saying what happened, and Johnny responded with, yeah, go ahead and write that down. Go ahead and write that down. But Johnny wouldn't sign the confession because he said he didn't actually make that confession, that those were lies. But he was arrested and charged with her murder all the same. They had his, and he did confirm, he actually stated, yes, I did break into the convent. Yes, I did go in there with the intent to steal things. But he says at that point, he never entered the nun's room, and he never killed her. He never had sex with her. He didn't do any of that. Well, then how is your knife from your house in there? Well, I brought it with me, and maybe he dropped it and didn't realize he dropped it. And maybe another person came in. Coincidence that two people break into the same convent in the same night? It's crazy, but maybe. So there was the physical evidence putting him in the convent, but again, he admitted to being in there. However, the fact they never tested the semen that was found with Sister Benz. Again, they would have only known the blood type, and had they tested it and had it not come back as being, Johnny Frank's blood type, Johnny Frank Garrett's blood type, then this never would have moved forward. But they never tested it at all. But at the trial, the written out confession that was not signed by Johnny Frank Garrett, and even though he, in his defense, denied ever saying that he killed her, they also presented the evidence of the fingerprints, the knife that it was from his house. It was apparently enough. And I understand why it was enough, especially back in 1981. And there's a reason, by the way, why I feel like I have some doubts, because so far I presented it in a way that seems like he's probably the guy. But I'll get to something else here in a few minutes. Johnny Frank Garrett was convicted of the murder. When he was convicted, if he did commit this crime, he was 17 years old at the time. This is Amarillo, Texas. This is Texas. They execute anyone. So he was sentenced to death after he was convicted of the murder. Later on, during a couple of his appeals, he would bring up the fact that the DNA was never tested. It was never tested, and they still don't have the technology to really test it yet. His appeal attorneys would state that, Johnny had a super low IQ. He had mental health issues. He had a criminal past. The detectives and the prosecutors just wanted it to be an easy, open and shut case. He's the guy. I mean, he just has to be the guy, so he's the guy. So his appeals get denied. His execution was scheduled for January 6th, 1992, but within an hour of the execution, the governor of Texas at the time gave him a reprieve because Pope John Paul II came forward in defense of Johnny. Then it goes to the Texas, Board of Paroles and Pardons. They vote on this, and it's 17-0, and he's then rescheduled to be executed. His attorneys are trying to get any other kind of reprieve, And this is when Johnny's history comes into play. A psychologist would work with Johnny for some time while he's on death row. Johnny had severe mental health issues. And this is because he had an extremely abusive upbringing. He had severe head trauma from when he was a child. He had brain injuries, and that led to paranoid delusions. He, while on death row, because of his delusions, said the lethal injection won't even kill me, that he would be okay. Johnny, throughout his childhood, was repeatedly sexually assaulted by his stepfather many times. He was also beaten physically by his stepfather. He was forced to perform sexual acts on his stepfather. He was also forced into filming pornographic films as a child by his stepfather. There were like numerous videos recorded of this kid doing pornographic things. I'm talking like 8, 9, 10 years old. And because of the people he was around, these abusive people, his brain was also subjected to substances like paint thinners and drugs. None of this information was given to the jury during his trial. None of this information was given to the jury when it came to sentencing him, because it is not something, you cannot execute someone who is mentally unwell, someone who is psychotic, someone who has a very low IQ. Johnny was one of the most qualified, if you will, people. Even if he did commit the crime or didn't commit the crime, he was the most qualified to not be executed, just based on all of the credentials that he had. Severe mental health issues. He was a paranoid delusion. His brain was broken. His IQ was extremely low. Like, this all should have been, yeah, we can't execute this guy. We can put him away for the rest of his life, but we can't execute him. All of that then was presented to, I guess, in order to get like a last minute stay of execution. It didn't work. They still said, okay, they actually said, yes, he is unwell. We can see that he is definitely not well up here, but he was well enough to know what he was doing when he killed Sister Benz and sexually assaulted her. Okay, again, yeehaw, this is Texas. On February 11th, 1992, at the Huntsville Correctional Facility in Texas, 28-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett was executed by lethal injection. There was rumors going around that Johnny's last words were, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and for taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss my ass." However, the official word is that he actually gave no final statement. And so that's always been, I guess, up for debate of whether he said that or not. So here's where the real doubt comes in. 12 years later, 12 years after Johnny was executed, they would take that DNA, thanks to an attorney who was basically working with Johnny's family to, get him exonerated even after death, to say, because everyone believed that he was innocent. Like, the people around him, everyone just swore up and down he was innocent. They still had DNA from the sexual assault kits that was done on Sister Benz. So 12 years after he's executed, they actually get approval to test that DNA. It did not match Johnny Frank Garrett. It did match someone else. A man named, and I might say his name wrong, Leoncio Perez Rueda. Well, who was he? Well, he, at the time they did this test, was a convicted murderer. He sexually assaulted and murdered a 77-year-old woman named Narnie Box Bryson. I don't know what other evidence they had, but I read somewhere that there was other evidence at the crime scene of Sister Benz's crime scene that would also place Mr. Rueda there at her crime scene. But the fact of the matter is the individual who sexually assaulted her the night of her murder was not Johnny Frank Garrett. It was this Mr. Rueda, who is now in prison for the exact same crime, for sexually assaulting and murdering in the same way, by the way, in the same method. Sister Benz is also in her late 70s. She's sexually assaulted. She's murdered the same way this other victim was murdered. His DNA. And so now what people are saying, these people who are just unable to accept that they may have gotten this wrong, they said, well, okay, that's just evidence that she was sexually assaulted by another man and then was killed by Johnny. But then that means that Johnny and this Leoncio person were working together, and they had no evidence to support that at all. There's no evidence they even knew each other. These are like two very different people. Johnny placed himself in the convent. He said he broke in earlier that night with the intent of stealing things. He brought his own tools with him, probably the knife. He may have dropped it. And then by chance someone else broke in and sexually assaulted the nun. What are the odds of this man sexually assaulting her but not killing her? Just doing that and then leaving. Considering 3 months later, he goes on to do the exact same thing to another woman and murders her. But as it stands, he is serving the rest of his life in prison for that murder. He has never been charged in any connection with the murder of Sister Tadia Benz, because, according to the state of Texas, they got the right guy, they executed him. He's dead. Even if Johnny was the killer, there is so much that goes against executing him, just based on the rule of law, the qualifications and all of that. He should not have been executed. He shouldn't have been. I mean, listen, I'm not anti-death penalty. I'm not pro-death penalty. I'm kind of like in the middle. Like, if you 100% committed that crime, we know that for an absolute fact, and you're sentenced to death, it's kind of like, that's your punishment. But if there's doubt that a person committed a murder, you shouldn't be so quick to just execute them. Especially someone who is what Johnny was. Like, it's frustrating. And then you have that DNA evidence that comes out 12 years after he's executed that someone else sexually assaulted this woman. And they're still saying, well, yeah, okay. And at the end, Sister Tadia Benz is the victim here. Did she get justice? Did she really? We don't know, because it sounds like Texas just doesn't really, it's like, we're done with it. It's old news. Let's get over it. And if you executed the wrong man, then you have another victim on your hands, because that's murder. You killed an innocent person. The way I've grown up, that's called murder. It's just it's frustrating. It's so it's just like unbelievable that an innocent man, because it happens, innocent people have been executed. He isn't the first, if he is innocent. And if I were on a jury in this case and I had the evidence of his past, and then I was able to somehow, it was more current where we have that DNA, there's no way he would have been convicted. I wouldn't have said guilty. I would have had doubts. And that's the whole thing. Reasonable doubt, but too bad it was after the fact. So I just have to sit here and wonder, did Sister Tadia Benz truly get the justice she rightfully deserved? What do you guys think? Post your opinions below. But that is it for this case, True Crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I drew a blank. I don't know what to say. It was Halloween 2012. A young mother would go missing, and it was a man of God that turned out to be pure evil. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of John D. White. Viewer discretion is advised. Rebecca Jane Gay was born on March 26, 1988, and she was born in Midland, Michigan. In 2007, she graduated from Bullock Creek High School. She was a member of the equestrian team. She studied cosmetology. She apparently was really good at archery. She would go to In-Session School of Cosmetology, where she graduated. She worked for a time at, I guess, a store called Bo Rick's Hair Care. But at the time of this case, she was actually working at Goodwill, and she was in management. She was described as someone who would just live life to the absolute fullest. She was full of joy. She could be a bit quiet and maybe a little shy and reserved, but everyone who knew her said that she was an inspiration to them. At the time that this story happened, she was happily engaged to her fiance, and she had a son that she absolutely loved dearly, and her son meant the entire world to her. She was a phenomenal mom, and she would do anything to make sure that her son had a good life. Unfortunately, Rebecca did not know that there was someone in her life who was wearing a mask, if you will, of kindness, of godliness. But the reality is, underneath that mask was someone who was pure evil. It was Halloween 2012. Rebecca, who at this time is now 24 years old, is excited for the day because, her 3-year-old son Conway gets to, trick or treat later. They decorated the house with scarecrows, and she had basically made plans with her fiance Aaron to go trick or treating later that night with Conway. But it was Halloween morning, afternoon, I believe, and Rebecca was supposed to work that day, but she didn't show up to work. When her coworkers tried calling, she didn't pick up the phone. Very unusual for her. And so they go to her home. They notice her car is parked pretty much where it normally is, near her trailer, and she doesn't answer the door. They knock on the door, they knock on the windows. Rebecca isn't responding to anything. So I believe at that point her mom is told about Rebecca isn't anywhere, she can't be found. So she goes to her home, and then the landlord opens up the door, Rebecca's house, and they find her purse there, they find her belongings there. Nothing looks amiss per se, but Rebecca is gone. So when police arrive, because they call police to report her missing, when they go inside her home, they do see signs of a struggle taking place, or had taken place there. They also noticed that there was a chunk of carpet that to them looked like it was wiped clean, recently, and it was still kind of damp. They look at her car, everything is in normal condition, but where the heck is Rebecca? So police, they go door to door and they start asking everyone in that neighborhood if they saw or heard anything. They're also questioning her family, and they're questioning Aaron, her fiance, and they question Conway's father because Aaron was not the dad. But none of them came off as being suspicious, and from what I understand, police were able to clear Aaron and the Conway's dad from being involved in whatever may have happened here, which they don't even know what happened at this point. And then they interview a man named John White, 55-year-old man who is a minister in the area. He has a small congregation of 12 to 15 people, and he was engaged to a woman named Sally Gay, Rebecca's mom. John White was actually someone who had been in their life for a little while, and he would babysit Conway from time to time, which in hindsight is terrifying. And when police talked to John, he came off as very concerned, oh my God, she's missing. He came off as genuinely, where is she? Well, police look into John White because they're looking into every person in her life. So they find out that he has been a pastor or minister, there for the past 3 years in Isabella County, which is in Michigan. What his community did not know, what his congregation at his little church did not know, was that he had a very dark history. John was a member of the United States Navy for some time, and then after that he became a trucker. And then in 1980, he, while living in Battle Creek, Michigan, would attack a woman, and this is when he was about 22 years old. He invited a 17-year-old neighbor over to his home, and her name was Teresa Etherton. He said, "Hey, come down to my basement. I have this cool little, car racetrack thing set up. It's really cool. I want to show it to you." And so she goes down there because she trusts him. He's a very trusting man, at least back then. So when she gets down there, he immediately attacks her, without hesitation. He takes a knife and he stabs her 15 times, and he begins to choke her. And according to her, he said, quote, "You're going to go now. I'm really sorry you had to go like this, but what the fuck? You're just a woman," unquote. Teresa managed to escape. She got away, and she survived the stabbing. And pretty much right away, John White was arrested and charged with the assault, and he was convicted of it. But he was able to appeal his conviction and get his sentence drastically reduced. So by 1983, after serving only about 2 years in prison for this violent assault, he's released. He was required, with his conditions of his release, that he had to seek mental health treatment, which they had to monitor, and he apparently did so. I guess a few years later, Teresa is out at a restaurant or shopping somewhere when she hears a man's voice, and she immediately is like, tenses up because it's John White, and he's just like talking in her area, like wherever they were. Apparently she didn't know he was out, and so this like terrified the Christ out of her, which I understand. I mean, completely understand that. But thankfully, he never really interacted with her, at all. Fast forwarding now to July of 1994, a 26-year-old woman named Vicky Sue Hall just ups and vanishes. This was in Comstock Township, Michigan. Now, at this point in 1994, John is married and he has a couple of kids. And his marriage appears to be good, I guess, on the surface. Well, when Vicky goes missing, they discovered that John was working at a textile factory at this time, the same place that Vicky was working, and they knew each other. And they found out, police, that Vicky and John were having an affair. They don't know exactly how long it was going on, but they do know that it happened. So at any rate, when police are looking into her disappearance, they find her on CCTV, leaving a grocery store and getting into a pickup truck driven by a bearded man. They would identify that truck as to belonging to John, and he also had a beard, so they put two and two together. It was John who picked her up. So when they bring him in for questioning, he says, yeah, we had an affair. I'll admit that, but I didn't do anything to her. I did pick her up and I just dropped her off somewhere. And they had no evidence to suggest he did anything to her because they hadn't found her yet. There was no blood or anything in his vehicle. So they just questioned him and then had to let him go. And then 6 weeks after she vanishes, Vicky is found. She was roughly 2 miles from where she was last seen, and her body was in a bad decomposition state. She was nude, but she was so decomposed that it was basically impossible for them to tell how she died. So when they first interviewed John, they were only able to do a very cursory check of his truck. They didn't have a warrant to actually go in there and forensically analyze his truck before they had found her body. But when they found her body, and now they can put a timeline as to when she was probably killed, which is probably around the time John picked her up from that grocery store, they were able to get a warrant, and they were able to now search his truck thoroughly, which means they were able to use luminol. They sprayed his truck, and like they always say, it lit up like a Christmas tree. And so I guess John would end up, once they found that evidence of blood, I don't know, I don't think they tested it to confirm it was Vicky's blood, but I think it was pretty much a given. And so John, because they didn't have a shit ton of evidence, but they had enough to possibly go to trial with this, John would end up pleading guilty to manslaughter charges. And so he was given a sentence of only 8 to 15 years. So John is spending time in prison now, and he was required to see a psychologist, and he would admit to the psychologist some disgusting things. He had fantasies about wanting to sleep with a dead body, to have sex with a dead body. He wanted to be a necrophiliac. I don't know if they really determined if that's what he did with Vicky, but it kind of sounds like he may have tried. John would serve a little under 13 years in prison before he was paroled out. So this was in about 2007 or so. He moves to the Mount Pleasant, Michigan area, where he starts the Christ Community Fellowship Church, where he is the minister. Very small congregation, but he is a minister. And then along the way, but sometime after 2007, but before 2012, he meets Sally Gay. They become an item and they get engaged and they're set to marry. And through this, he is now in the life of Sally's daughter, Rebecca, and also Rebecca's son, Conway. You know, when Rebecca would work, sometimes they would let John White babysit him, and they did not know about his past. They had no idea. Now we're back to Halloween of 2012. They're interviewing John White, and they're finding out about his past. And now they're really thinking, okay, this guy may be our guy, but where is Rebecca? So anyway, he tells them that that morning he arrived at about 6:30 or so, which was normal, to go and pick up Conway to watch him. And then it was custom for John, when he babysat, to drop Conway off with Conway's dad. And that's exactly what he did that day, apparently. According to Conway's biological father, you know, he was dropped off by John and he was unharmed and no one was none the wiser. He says that when he was at Rebecca's trailer, before he would, you know, take Conway to his dad's, because there was a chunk of time when he would be there technically babysitting Conway, he said he didn't see Rebecca leave. He just, last thing he remembers is that he went to lay on the couch and he fell asleep, and that when he woke up, Rebecca was gone. So he assumed she left for work. They asked John, hey, will you take a polygraph test? And he at first was like, I have a bad past and I don't want that to, like, you know, interfere with the polygraph. But Sally, Rebecca's mom, was like, for me, will you please take this damn thing? And so he does. He takes it. Well, as John is taking the polygraph test, which, by the way, he would later fail, but keep in mind, polygraph tests, as we've said before, are really just an investigative tool. They're not a conclusive proof if someone is innocent or guilty, but he did fail it for what it's worth. But as they're, you know, giving him this test, they have a warrant to search his vehicle. They search his truck, and in the bed of his truck, they find a necklace and they find a little bit of blood. They also get a warrant to search his home. And at the home, they find, like, I guess in a bag he had, like, sealed up, a mallet, zip ties, these big giant trash bags, and women's underwear. Why, John? Why? So police, as they're finding this evidence, they kind of go back to John and say, hey, look, here's a photo of some blood we found in your truck and a necklace. What's that about? He goes, I have no idea how that got there. And then suddenly on November 1st, so this is the next day after Halloween, he tells police, all right, I'll come clean. He said if he confesses, he wants a life sentence and he wants to be segregated from the other prisoners. I've never heard that one before. So what he tells police is that the night before, so on October 30th, he is at home. He is getting drunk out of his mind. He's watching porn. And some of that porn is sexual acts on dead people, necrophiliac stuff. He said that really intrigued him. That really tickled his fancy and he wanted to try it. And he said he had fantasized about doing that thing with Rebecca. So he and Sally lived, I guess, just a couple places down from Rebecca. And so that night, after he's drunk and watching all that gross stuff, he decides to walk over to Rebecca's house where he knows that she keeps her door unlocked, and he just enters her home. He says that when he got inside, he made sure Conway was asleep. I believe Rebecca was asleep as well. He took that rubber mallet that police had found later, and he bludgeoned her over the head with that several times. And then he took a zip tie, one of those big industrial zip ties, and he wrapped it around her throat and he pulled really tight, choking her. And then he made sure she was dead. Then he dragged her to the kitchen and he took off all of her clothes. Later on, the autopsy would show that she was sexually assaulted. They said either just before death or shortly after. And I believe he would say that he did do what he planned to do in terms of the necrophiliac stuff. But at any rate, when he was done, he put her into one of those giant trash bags, then loaded her in the back of his truck, drove to a nearby ravine where he dumped her like she was garbage. They would find in kind of a field near this ravine, they would go and they actually would find her body. And so later they would, and that's how later they would determine that she was sexually assaulted. And they did notice that she did have some sort of markings around her neck, like a thin line to indicate that someone did choke her with a ligature. So that confirms his story. And she had a lot of abrasions and like skull fractures and whatnot. So she was clearly also bludgeoned. This was just a sick fantasy he wanted to live out. That was his motive. That was his reason. He just wanted to do that to her. He wanted to kill her and then do that disgusting shit with her afterwards. So he would end up pleading guilty to second-degree murder, which is insane to me because it sounds more like planned first-degree premeditated homicide, but I guess it is what it is. And he agreed to plead to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 56 to, I think, 83 years in prison, which was really bizarre. Like, I've never heard of that kind of sentence before. But John White wouldn't serve 56 years. He would barely serve 1. In August of 2013, prison guards would go to John's cell, and they found him swinging from a makeshift rope. John was dead. He hung himself. So, in the end, John White attempted to kill 1 woman, successfully murdered 2 women, and at least had intercourse with 1 of them after they were deceased, possibly 2 of them. This so-called minister took the coward's way out, didn't want to face the music, so to speak. He didn't want to have to be punished for what he did, and so he just ended it. I guess it's good in the end, right? He's dead. He can't hurt anyone else again, so that's a positive. I just can't help but wonder, had he served maybe, I don't know, the rest of his life in prison for murdering another person, knowing that he had attempted to murder a woman years prior? Like, that's kind of a pattern almost, right? Red flags. Maybe let's not say, we're going to give you 8 to 15 years for brutally murdering someone. And then let him go back out into the world. Like, it's insane to me. Because if he was in prison for the rest of his life for taking a life, Rebecca would be alive. Conway would have his mom. Conway never got to go trick-or-treating with his mom that night, and they were so excited to do so. And Conway would now have to go every Halloween as a child without his mom. Every Christmas without his mom. Every birthday without his mom. Because a sick man wanted to do a very disturbing thing to his mother. Something he never should have been able to do. But John's dead, so I guess in some way you can say that Rebecca and Conway and Sally all got the justice they rightfully deserved.
Crime. It happens. Apparently it happened a lot on Halloween. I had a whole playlist of more Halloween cases on my backup page, my scarier page. Must have posted several videos during, multiple bans, blah, 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 from my main page. So here's like a slew of Halloween cases, but also a couple additional cases that I found in random playlists. And then a couple other just random spooky videos. This is just a smorgasbord. It's a crimesborg. No, Mike, it's not. But anyway, Mike, just turn off. If only it were that simple. What am I doing? This is so awkward. I always make this incredibly uncomfortable. Anyway, just get to the video. Mike, all right? Just here, fine. Enjoy 20-something more stories and stuff. Fart knockers, geek burgers, jerkwads. Viewer discretion is advised. I love you all so dearly. One of these people would vanish from a Halloween party in 2014. Would they ever be found? Hello, true crimerers. This is another deadly Halloween. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured behind me was 22-year-old Chelsea Bruck from Monroe, Michigan. On the night of October 25th, 2014, which would then lead into the morning of October 26, 2014, Chelsea would attend a humongous Halloween party, and she would go dressed as Poison Ivy. They say there was upwards of 1,000 people at this party. It was a wild night. And by all accounts, she was having a great time. There wasn't any drama. She was there with friends. According to witness testimony, sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning, Chelsea would be seen leaving the party with an unidentified male. This is the composite drawing that they came up with. And after that, Chelsea would never be seen alive again. By October 28th, a couple of days later, when Chelsea still hadn't made her presence known, her family became extremely concerned, and they would officially file a missing persons report. Police would begin questioning everyone from the party, or at least everyone they could get. They scoured videos and photos from the party, trying to see exactly where Chelsea was at all times that they could track her, just to see if they could figure out who this unknown man was that she left with. And yes, this photo is from that exact night. The family, friends, the police, they all began a massive search. But they find nothing for months. And then on April 5th, 2015, they would find the exact poison ivy costume that Chelsea was wearing that night, thrown into some industrial site off the road. There were traces of male DNA on the costume. And then on April 24th, 2015, buried in a shallow grave near a construction site, they would find the remains of Chelsea Bruck. It took 6 months to find her. It wouldn't be until 2016 when they would finally get a DNA hit from the bodily fluid that was left on the poison ivy costume. And it matched a man by the name of Daniel Allen Clay. The day after he was arrested, he would confess to the murder. He claims that they were having consensual sex. He claims that she asked him to choke her, which he admits he did for about 30 seconds, and then she stopped breathing, and he couldn't revive her. Interesting, because her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Gee, Dan, how did that happen? Well, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. He said he was extremely sorry and that he fucked up. He was sentenced to life without parole. On Halloween night 2012, a woman would be murdered and dumped in this field, and her killer never should have even been free to do so. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of John White. Viewer discretion is advised. Oh, where the fudge do we even start? So in 1980, when John was 22 years old, he was living in Battle Creek, Michigan. One day, he would invite a 17-year-old girl named Teresa Etherton into his basement. He said he wanted her to see a racetrack he set up. And then, for some reason, he stabbed her 15 times. And then he choked her. He said to her, and I quote, "You're going to go now. I'm really sorry you had to go like this, but what the fuck? You're just a woman." Teresa survived. John White was arrested. He would be convicted, but then he won an appeal, stating that his attorney didn't allow him to argue insanity. So the courts released him. Good job. In July of 1994, in Comstock Township, Michigan, 26-year-old Vicky Sue Wall disappeared. John White had a brief affair with her. Surveillance footage showed that she was taken from a grocery store parking lot by a bearded man at 3 a.m. 6 weeks later, her body was found. John was questioned, arrested, but because there was no physical evidence, he would plead no contest. He got an 8 to 15-year jail sentence. He was released in 2007. He once told a prison therapist that he fantasized about having intercourse with dead bodies. Now we're in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, 2012. John met a woman named Sally Gay. Don't be stupid about her name in the comments. They even got engaged to be married. This is Sally, by the way. By the way, John, he became a pastor at Christ Community Fellowship Church. It's where he met Sally. Sally had a few daughters, one of them being Rebecca Gay. He would later state he fantasized about having intercourse with her dead body. Well, on October 31st, 2012, he would go to Rebecca's trailer in the same neighborhood he lived. He would then strike her repeatedly with a rubber mallet. He then put a zip tie around her neck and tightened it, strangled her until she died. By the way, her 3-year-old son, he was in the next room. He allegedly had intercourse with her corpse, and then dumped her like garbage in this field. In 2013, he was convicted and was sentenced to 56 years in prison. He was 55 at the time. Oh, he turned into a pumpkin Santa Claus! And on August 28th, 2013, he took his own life in his prison cell. Oh no. On a Halloween night in Quebec, Canada, a man would unleash a random attack. Hello, true crimerers. It's time for another deadly Halloween. And this is the case of the Quebec City stabbing. At approximately 10:30 p.m., as the Halloween festivities were winding down, a 24-year-old man would be walking down the streets of Quebec City. This would be specifically near the Parliament building. He was dressed in costume with some sort of medieval garb, but unfortunately the sword in his hand, unlike this man's, was very real. In fact, his sword was described as a katana-style saber. Well, he chose people at random and started to stab them. The first victim, a 56-year-old man by the name of Francois Duchesne, well, he was snuck up on and had his throat slit, and he would die instantly. The authorities were called in virtually right as the man started to do this. He would then continue to chase down random people. He managed to stab and injure at least 5 people, but then he would also manage to kill one more person. The second fatal victim was a 61-year-old woman. Her name was Suzanne Claremont. Now, all of this happened relatively quickly, and the police were eventually able to surround the suspect, and they would finally capture him. The man would be quickly identified. It was a 24-year-old man from Montreal, and his name was Carl Gerard. The police were able to determine he intended to kill a lot more people. He even had gasoline canisters in his vehicle, suggesting that he was planning to start fires as well. Now, this is a scenario where it's kind of good that COVID was around, because this was just last Halloween. October 31st, 2020. And in Quebec, they had pretty strict lockdown procedures, and for Halloween weekend, it was a lockdown weekend. So the streets were not highly populated, and there were virtually no tourists. Or else this could have been significantly worse. They said his motive was personal. Apparently he had threatened to do something similar, and he told a therapist this 5 years prior, but I'm not sure why this wasn't addressed then. I don't know. On June 18th, 2021, the prosecutor for this case filed a direct indictment, which means that this case would go directly to trial without any kind of preliminary hearing. That trial has not happened yet. Worst deaths imaginable, backup page edition. Hello, true crimerers. Viewer discretion is advised, and also this is another elevator story, so if you are easily triggered by elevator things, you may not want to watch this. This was Jose Sandoval Opazzo, and he was originally from Italy. He was an electrician aboard the Carnival Cruise Ecstasy. And on December 27th, 2015, while the Ecstasy was about 27 nautical miles from Grand Bahama Island, on its last leg of a 3-day cruise, he was working on top of an elevator. This is not him, of course, this is just to show you what it would look like. The elevator in this instance was stopped on the 6th floor. He allegedly had the elevator door propped open with a screwdriver, and an investigation would find out that he had also disabled a safety feature on the elevator, something that apparently is common with electricians who are working in elevators. When all of a sudden, the elevator began to move. It was now moving from the 6th floor up to the 9th floor. The movement of the elevator, they believe, startled him, and he fell backwards, and he fell down the side of the elevator. There is very little room between the wall of the elevator shaft and the elevator itself. Almost no room. So Jose, he would be compressed between the wall of the elevator and the wall of the elevator shaft, between the extremely narrow walls of the elevator. His body was crushed
and from what I understand, dragged up the elevator shaft. Whew, Jesus Christ. Well, how did people find out? Let me tell you. Because the elevator was now moving, people were able to board the elevator. And a passenger who was waiting outside said he heard what sounded like a rushing waterfall. And this is when people were noticing a literal waterfall of blood rushing down the front of the elevator doors. It was like, if you've seen the movie The Shining, that's the visual I had. There's no telling for sure how long it took for him to die, but by the sounds of it, it was relatively quickly. At least that's what I could hope. Apparently, there were people who took photos and video of the blood not knowing what it was beforehand and posted it online. I haven't seen it, but the way that the blood was pouring would indicate there wasn't much of him left. The death was ruled an accident. Carnival Cruise was not held liable because it wasn't their fault. I knew I hated elevators for a reason. On a Halloween night, a baby would be stolen from her home, and it would only get worse from there. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another deadly Halloween. Viewer discretion is advised. This little angel here was a 19-month-old baby named Nema Louise Parker, and she lived, of course, with her parents in Lawton, Oklahoma. On Halloween night in 1977, Nema was in her crib, which this is her actual crib here. Now, she had been crying a lot that night. Her parents were trying to do the, let her cry it out and kind of fall asleep thing. I know a lot of parents do that. Totally normal. Eventually, the crying stopped and Nema's parents went to bed. The next morning, Nema's mother, Rose, went to check on her and she wasn't in her crib. She asked her husband, George, have you seen Nema? He said no. They searched the entire home. Nema was gone. Immediately, the police were brought in. It was treated as a child abduction. George worked under the suspicion that somebody was already in her nursery when everyone went to bed. The nursery window was locked. The front door was locked. It is very possible that her kidnapper was hiding in the closet. They searched and searched and searched for her. And sadly, on the day before Thanksgiving, a horrible discovery was made. A group of children were messing around in an abandoned house. They opened up this refrigerator, and little Nema was inside, dead. The autopsy would show that she died from asphyxiation. She suffocated. The family obviously was devastated. The Carters would tell authorities that about 2 months prior to this murder, someone would mysteriously poison their dog. And then a few days after that, someone vandalized their home. Could that person who did those things be connected to this? Well, that person was never found. In fact, the only suspect they had was a woman named Jackie Robideau. This was a 17-year-old babysitter who did babysit Nema. I don't know why, but twins always freak me out. Jackie was accused of murdering one of these twins. These were the Carpenter twins. And before the Nema story, these two girls would also go missing. Jackie babysat them. They would both be found in a refrigerator. One of them died. Now, Nema's father doesn't actually think Jackie did this, even though it's clear she did kill one of the Carpenter twins. But she had access to the house, to the baby. Captain Blurryface here, Jackie, she was convicted of killing one of the twins. She would die in prison. And Nema has still not gotten justice. After a Halloween party, a young girl would go missing, and days later, she would be found dead. Hello, true crimerers. This is another episode of Deadly Halloween, and it is the case of Shauna Howe. Viewer discretion is advised. Shauna was an 11-year-old girl from Oil City, Pennsylvania, and she was a member of the Girl Scouts. On the night of October 27th, 1992, Shauna would leave a Girl Scouts Halloween party. Her parents were expecting her back a little after 8 p.m. because that's when the party was ending. And the party was relatively close to her house, so she was walking home. Shauna never got home. Her parents, obviously filled with worry, they would call the police, and she was immediately reported missing.
A witness would come forward that on that night, a little after 8 p.m., at the corner of West 1st Street and Reed Street, they would see a man who resembled this man, Eldred Ted Walker. The witness said that this man approached Shauna, and then the witness heard screaming and then saw a car skid away. The police were familiar with Eldred, so they picked him up, they questioned him, and then he, of course, denied all of it. On October 29th, 1992, just a couple of days later, they would find a piece of Shauna's costume, which was a gymnastic costume. They found it in a wooded area, and it was kind of near a railroad track, but at the time there was no sign of Shauna herself. That would change the next day. About 200 yards away from where they found Shauna's costume, they would then find the body of Shauna. The autopsy would show something pretty horrific. She was sexually assaulted. The clothing she did have on had traces of male DNA. Her mouth also had traces of male DNA. Where she was found was under like a trestle or a bridge. They determined that she was alive before she hit the ground. So her abductors had their way with this little girl, threw her over a bridge while she was still alive, and then she would die of blunt force trauma because she landed on a very dry, very hard surface with rocks. There was trauma to her head and to her chest. But the investigation went cold, and it stayed cold for about 10 years. In 2002, they finally got a DNA hit. Andy Richter? No! Oh no, that's not him. It matched a man by the name of James O'Brien. He was already in prison for attempting to kidnap someone else. He was never a suspect in the Shauna Howe case. Well, Eldred came back into the picture. He would confess, yep, he did kidnap the girl, but it was these two brothers, James and Tim O'Brien, who actually killed her. He got 40 years, they got life without parole. This is a terrifying composite drawing, and it's of an unknown man believed to have murdered a young girl. Hello, true crimerers. It's time for another episode of Babysitter Murders, and this is the case of Kelly Cook. Viewer discretion is advised. This story takes us to a little village in Alberta, Canada, and we are going back to April 22nd, 1981. And Kelly Cook was a 15-year-old girl who dabbled in babysitting. At approximately 8:20 in the morning on that day in April, the Cook residence would get a phone call. A man identified himself as Bill Christensen was on the other end, stating that he would like to inquire about the babysitting services of Kelly Cook. This man had actually tried calling another babysitter first, but they had to decline, and that babysitter is who recommended Kelly Cook. That's why a lot of people refer to this case as the backup babysitter. At 8:30 p.m. that same night, a man driving a full-sized North American car, I don't know what that means, they pulled up to the Cook residence. Kelly gave her parents some love, and Kelly's mom said, "Please call us when you get there." Kelly agreed. She walked out the door, got in the car, closed the door, and that was the last time anyone would ever see Kelly alive again. Kelly never called her mother. And unfortunately, they never got the address of where he was supposed to be taking her to babysit. There never was a house. There never was a babysitting job. The RCMP would believe that this was a premeditated, planned attack. They think this person planned this over the course of a month, possibly 2 months. The initial babysitter was likely the preferred victim, but this Bill Christensen settled for Kelly Cook. They searched and searched for her, but nothing. She just poofed into thin air. That is until June 28th, 1981. Floating in the Chin Lake Reservoir in Alberta, Canada, would be the body of 15-year-old Kelly Cook. She was bound with rope, weighed down with cinder blocks. She was fully clothed, no sign of sexual assault, and she was very badly decomposed. She had to be identified through dental records. This was a composite drawing of Bill Christensen. This was made from some people who worked at a gas station who believe they saw this man. But then the RCMP, they would later on take this photo off of their official website. Why doesn't he have eyes? I don't like that. And that's it. Her murder is unsolved, and they have virtually nothing to go on. Who killed Kelly Cook? Worst deaths imaginable, backup page edition number 2. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, true crimerers. I will be continuing to use this page until at least August 14th when I'm allowed to post on my main page again. This was 26-year-old James Thim from Beatrice, Nebraska. He was a member of the Yahweh cult in Rulo, Nebraska, which was, oh Jesus, Children of the Corn vibes over here. The cult was led by Michael Ryan, and their base of operations was this farmhouse that was owned by a man named Rick Stice. This was a small chapter of the Yahweh cult. It had roughly 20 to 25 members. Well, Michael Ryan here says he was told by God to murder James Thim, who had recently been demoted in the cult to the slave title. Well, murder him by torturing him. And what better activity is there to bond with your son? So he got the help of his teenage son, Dennis Ryan. This is where I remind you again, viewer discretion is advised. This is a very triggering thing. You see, the owner of the farm, Rick Stice, was also recently demoted to a slave. Thim was told to sexually assault Rick Stice. Oh, and then Rick Stice was told to do the same thing to his own 5-year-old son, Luke. And they forced Luke to return the act. 5-year-old Luke would end up being killed by Michael Ryan when he pushed him too many times into a desk. Thim was strung up by chains in a shed. They kicked him repeatedly, bullwhipped him, and this stuff went on for days, by the way. Michael Ryan, he forced James to bend over a crate, and he shoved a shovel handle up. Later, the autopsy report would show that the shovel handle went at least 2 feet into his body. Michael and his son Dennis would repeatedly sexually assault him to the point where it actually ruptured his rectal area. They then again went back to whipping him, and then Michael Ryan took out a gun and shot his fingertips off. Then they took a razor blade, and while he was still alive, they slowly sliced the skin off of his legs, and he screamed in horrible, bloody agony. Michael Ryan then jumped on top of his chest repeatedly until James would die. Him and 5-year-old Luke were dumped into unmarked graves. Michael Ryan was sentenced to death for this. He died in 2015 of cancer. And his son, Jebediah over here, he only got 12 years in prison due to a legal technicality. He roams free. On Halloween in 1979, a woman would be murdered and discarded like garbage, and for 40 years, she would only be known as Orange Socks Girl. Hello, true crimerers. This is another deadly Halloween. And this is the case of Deborah Louise Jackson. Viewer discretion is advised. Sometime in the early morning hours of October 31st, 1979, in Georgetown, Texas, the body of an unknown woman would be found lying in a culvert. And this was off of Interstate 35, and authorities believe that she was actually thrown over a guardrail and just discarded like trash. These were the initial composite drawings done of her since she had no identity on her, and she was not matching any missing persons known at the time. In the autopsy, they discovered a significant amount of bruising around her neck, so her cause of death was strangulation. She did have bruises all over her body as well, but they believe this is because when she was thrown over the overpass and hit the cement, this caused bruising, which would be a good indication that she had actually been murdered not too long before she was discovered. So the exact day cause of death, they believe, was the morning of Halloween. They tried to identify her in the initial goings of this investigation, but they were never successful at it. She had also been sexually assaulted, by the way. Now, since they had no identity for her, they would label her as Orange Socks, because she was wearing a pair of orange socks, but that was about it. Oh god, it never gets easier. Go! People magazine's 1982 Sexiest Man Alive, Henry Lee Lucas, would end up confessing to her murder. However, they had no actual evidence to connect him to that murder. This is the man known as the Confession Killer. He confessed to thousands of murders and sexual assaults. The majority of them were not even true. He, along with his buddy Otis Toole, they just clearly wanted fame. Now, they obviously murdered people, just not as many as they claimed. He claims he picked up orange socks in Oklahoma. And after she turned down his advances, and I don't know why, look at that face. He said he pulled a car over, sexually assaulted her, and strangled her to death. And then also sexually assaulted her when she was dead. Now, according to records, Henry Lee Lucas was supposedly in Florida at the time, but Orange Socks was killed in Texas. That being said, he was convicted for her murder, and then he died in 2001. In 2019, through DNA, Orange Socks finally was identified. Her name was Deborah Jackson, and she was 22 years old, and she disappeared from Abilene, Texas in 1977. So at least her family finally got some closure. Also in 2019, they found DNA on her socks, and it was from 2 different men, but I don't think they've matched it to anyone yet. On a Halloween night in 1982, hello. All right. An older couple would be terrorized. Yeah, no, I see you. Hello, true crimeers. This is another deadly Halloween. And this is the case of Marvin Brandland. Oh. This story takes place in Fort Dodge, Iowa, with Ethel and Marvin Brandland. They had spent their evening handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. They absolutely enjoyed doing it. They thought they were done for the night, but there would be one more knock on their front door. They went to the door together, opened it, and standing before them was a grown man wearing a pillowcase with just the eyes cut out. And he said, and I quote, "Trick or treat, give me your money or I'll shoot." Now, Ethel at first thought it was a joke. She thought this was one of her family members trying to play a joke on them. She actually reached for the pillowcase to try lifting it above their face, but the man grabbed the pillowcase and held it down firmly. So she turned around and walked towards the candy dish, and the man followed her inside the house. He then pulled out his gun and would point it at the couple. The assailant would order the couple down to the basement to where the safe was. This person knew they had a safe in their basement. Now, Marvin and his wife, they were not wealthy people. They did not have a plethora of money. He owned a little company that would service carpets, I assume for cleaning, but they weren't exactly rolling in it. Marvin was a World War II veteran. Now, at this point, they actually hadn't gotten to the basement yet, because they had to go through the kitchen. Marvin, kind of using his World War II background, thought he would try to go for the gun, so he did. This is when the assailant fired the gun and would shoot Marvin through the throat. Apparently, the assailant then ripped off the pillowcase and fled, but Ethel, who would survive this attack, didn't actually see him. Marvin would die shortly after at the hospital. This is Marvin and Ethel's granddaughter. Now, this is her now, but back on that fateful Halloween night, she had actually just left her grandparents' house not but a few minutes before this happened. She even told them, please don't answer the door after 7:30. But they did. She was just saying this, by the way, just out of concern for her elderly grandparents. To this very day, this case is unsolved. The family strongly believes someone in the family did this. Most of them have a specific person, but authorities aren't releasing their name. I guess time will tell. A man just doing his job would die in one of the worst deaths imaginable. Hello, true crimeers. This is the story of Ismael Martinez Huertas. Ismael was a sanitation worker for the city of Riverbank, California. He operated a garbage truck that was owned by Gilton Solid Waste Management. The truck he was driving, which is the exact one pictured here, he actually reported several times that there was an issue, specifically with the sensor on the hydraulic arm that would pick up the garbage cans. To give you an idea of how powerful these hydraulic arms actually are, this is an image from a completely unrelated story. The mechanical arm had basically crushed the garbage can, which you can see a fully intact one back there. So they're pretty powerful. On Monday, August 26, 2019, Ismail was doing his normal rounds, and about 3:30 p.m. he was on Homewood Way, which is right here. And by the way, he did all of this himself. He didn't have like anyone driving with him. So the image you're seeing is actually from one of those doorbell cameras. So allegedly it would pick up Ismail going to the garbage can because the mechanical arm wasn't working. It was malfunctioning in some way because, again, the sensor was having an issue, which even after all his complaints, they never fixed. So the garbage can was picked up, but then it fell inside of the truck itself. So Ismail would then climb inside and then he would try to retrieve the garbage can. Now the neighbor who caught this footage said, "I saw him go up, but then I never saw him come out." This is because the mechanical arm, well, it malfunctioned again, and this time it would prove to be a fatal issue. Now, I cannot find the exact details about what exactly happened, but Ismail would be crushed by the mechanical arm. What would happen was the arm, I guess, retracted back and it pinned him. And reminding you of this image, this is something similar, from what I understand, happened to him. It likely would not have been an instant death, but it is believed he did die rather quickly. No one heard any screams or cries for help, and it wouldn't be until nearly an hour later when people noticed the garbage truck hadn't moved for almost an hour, when people grew concerned and they called police. By 4:26 p.m., Ismail would be declared dead. The only information they ever really released was that he was crushed to death, but his exact cause of death has not been released. But it was due to the malfunctioning arm on the truck. Unfortunately, I cannot find any other updates, like in terms of lawsuits, but it's a bad way to go. This may look like an ordinary blood draw. However, it is anything but ordinary. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of John Schneeberger. Now, John here was originally from South Africa, and after getting his medical degree from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, he would move to Canada, specifically to Saskatchewan. Eventually, he would meet Lisa Dillman, and then they would get married in 1991. She already had 2 kids, but then they would have 2 kids of their own. Pictured here is a woman named Candace. She would also go by the name Candy. And on the night of October 31st, 1992, I guess this also counts as a Halloween case, she would actually be at Dr. Schneeberger's office. For whatever procedure she was having done, he would sedate her. However, she was not completely knocked out. And what would follow is a moment that she would never, ever forget. You see, not too long after this meeting with John Schneeberger, she would go to police and claim that he sexually assaulted her, and did so while the 23-year-old patient was sedated. She was positive that John assaulted her. Now, there was bodily fluid found inside Candace, and this was collected by authorities, so of course police obtained a warrant to collect John's DNA. John agreed to give his DNA, and they even recorded the moment he was getting his blood drawn. The results came back. It wasn't him. His DNA was not the DNA that was found inside Candace. But Candace was like, no, he did this. He sexually assaulted me. Please test his blood again. So they did, and he obliged. Once again, the DNA didn't match. So Candace hired her own private detective because she knew what happened. So this detective broke into John Schneeberger's car and obtained samples that would have DNA, his DNA, which when he had tested, it did match the DNA from her sexual assault kit. So the police got another warrant to collect John's DNA. But again, the blood sample they took from John didn't match, and the blood sample was just too degraded. John's wife, Lisa, she would find out that John was actually sexually assaulting her 15-year-old daughter from her first marriage. She reported this to the police. Once again, they took his DNA. This time, they took a swab of his mouth, they took blood, and they took hair. Finally, it matched. He did sexually assault Candace. How did he get away with it? He implanted a drain in his arm and filled it with another man's blood. He always managed to convince the phlebotomist to use that specific arm. He got 6 years. A brutal Halloween murder in London has been unsolved for nearly 58 years. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Catherine Lillian Armstrong. Viewer discretion, it's advised. This is the only picture I can find of her, but Catherine at the time of the story was a 70-year-old woman living on her own, and she lived in Sandyford, which is in Glasgow in the United Kingdom. She had retired in 1957, where she used to be a headmistress, and that was at Denton Road Junior School. She was a practicing Methodist at the Central Methodist Church. Now, on that Halloween night in 1963, she was actually expected at her church. This was because they had a weekly choir practice, which was done every Thursday, but she would never make it. Now, the very next morning, one of Catherine's cousins, whose name was Ada Ridley, she was going to stop by Catherine's house just to say hello. She got to her house around 10:30 a.m., this is her house right here, and she knocked on the door, but no one answered. So she knocked again. No one answered. She would try one more time a few minutes later. No answer. Ada had also noticed that all of the curtains were closed. This was unusual to her because Catherine was usually up very, very early with her curtains open, so something was wrong. So, concerned, Ada called police. They got there relatively quickly. They forced their way into the house, and right there confronting them at the very bottom of her staircase was the body of Catherine Armstrong. She had a dress on and she was wearing slippers. By all appearances, it looked like she was dressed and ready to go, minus the slippers, for a choir practice that night. She had a nylon stocking wrapped around her neck, and her face was bloodied. Police also noticed she had defense wounds on her hands. Now, no weapon was found, but the wounds initially looked like they were stab wounds. And when the autopsy was done, it appeared she had been stabbed at least 30 times. Police theorized that she was able to make her assailant bleed because there was blood all over the house. But there was no indication that Catherine had been moved anywhere. The house had no forced entry. Nothing was stolen. No fingerprints, no footprints, no shoe prints. And like I said, no murder weapon, no knife was found. Police questioned over 5,000 residences in the area, but it literally turned up nothing. The only thing they got was that some students had seen her looking out her window around 6:30 p.m. that night. Her choir practice was supposed to be 7:30. Police theorized maybe teenagers did this, possibly ex-students from her school, but sadly, to this very day, Catherine's killer has never been caught. Was it a Halloween prank gone wrong, or something more evil? At first glance, you might think you're staring into the faces of two innocent teenage boys, but the reality is you are actually staring at the faces of pure evil. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Bever family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. The Bever family was from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and it consisted of 9 family members. The dad was named David, the mother was named April, then you had 12-year-old Daniel, 7-year-old Christopher, 5-year-old Victoria, 13-year-old Crystal, 2-year-old Autumn, 18-year-old Robert, and 16-year-old Michael. On July 22nd, 2015, around 11:30 p.m., 12-year-old Daniel Bever would make a panicked phone call to 911. He would say, "My brothers, they are attacking us. They are attacking the whole family." They can hear screams in the background, and then the phone goes dead. Police would get to the house fairly quickly. They were able to hear some distant, kind of whispered cries from inside the house, so the officer just charged in. And what they found was something you should only ever see in a horror movie. But sadly, this was reality. They first saw 13-year-old Crystal Bever. She had multiple stab wounds, but she was actually still alive. Upstairs, they found 2-year-old Autumn. Thankfully, she was alive and she wasn't even harmed. But sadly, there were 5 dead bodies in the house. These 5 right here. Crystal was able to tell police it was our brothers, they did this. Teenagers Robert and Michael Bever. They used knives, hatchets, just anything sharp they can get their hands on, to stab brutally their whole family. They would later claim to say, oh, our parents were just super restrictive, they were strict, they homeschooled us. But neighbors would say that specifically these two boys always had some very strange behavior. After massacring their own family, they fled the house. But they would be caught really quickly. This is one of their arrest images. This is the other brother. In a very creepy interrogation, one of the brothers would flat out confess. He pointed them to a flash drive with their plans for the murders. They even found this really disturbing crayon drawing that one of them drew before they murdered their family. I hate when murderers smile. I can't stand it. Ugh. Police would find out they had about 3,000 rounds of ammunition being shipped to the house. They also had plans to continue killing after this. They said they wanted to murder 500 people. They were literally just two insane humans, and they would both get life in prison without the possibility of parole. Being burned alive is arguably one of the worst ways to die. And sadly, that is what happens in today's worst deaths imaginable. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here next to me was 68-year-old Dennis Antoporek. And in January of 2015, he and his wife were living at the Eden Isles condominiums in North Miami Beach, Florida. Around 11 p.m. on a January Sunday in 2015, Dennis would leave a little note on the fridge. Simply said, "Went to sauna." 3 hours after he left that note, his daughter Lara said, "Where's Dad?" He hadn't come home from the sauna and no one knew where he was. So she began searching the condominium, specifically, obviously, with the sauna first. When she got there, the sauna door was closed, so she had to pry it open. And inside, she found something absolutely horrifying. Lying on the floor of the sauna was a man she didn't recognize. It was a man with very dark skin. It couldn't be her father because he had very light skin. Until she noticed his clothing hanging on the wall. And the realization hit her. The man on the floor with very dark skin was, in fact, her father. An ambulance was immediately called, but unfortunately when they got there, they declared him dead. And more gruesome details would very soon emerge. Because of the heat, his body, his skin, it began to peel off. In fact, parts of his skin was literally stuck to the ground. The man was completely charred. When the autopsy was concluded, it was determined that he had died of a coronary. They believe this was a heat-induced heart attack. So, what caused this to happen? Aren't saunas supposed to turn off after a certain time? Yes, except this timer was broken. He didn't know that. Don't know if the condominiums knew that either. You see, Dennis used the sauna at these condominiums at least 3 times a week. He was a regular. He knew exactly how this all worked. Once the timer goes off, essentially the heat portion stops. But this timer didn't stop. It's entirely possible he fell asleep. It happens in saunas. But this man was essentially cooked to death. The coroner also said there had likely been heat-induced dehydration and a possibility of a stroke. All because of the heat. All because the sauna didn't shut off. So this poor man basically roasted to death. The family did file a lawsuit, but I'm having a hell of a time finding the results of that. They sued the condominiums, and I believe the people who made the sauna. But again, I don't know the outcome. Rest in peace, Dennis. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case known as the Blind River Murders. This was a story featured in a 1993 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and I remember this one terrifying the living garbage out of me. June 27th, 1991. At a rest stop off a beaten path in Blind River, Ontario, Canada, Gordon McAllister and his wife Jackie were on a road trip in their RV. They had started their trip in Lindsay, Ontario. They had been driving for a while, so they wanted to call it a night. So they pulled off into the rest stop, and they noticed that they were the only ones who were there. Rolling over into the next day in the early morning hours of 12:55 a.m. on June 28th, Gordon and his wife Jackie were asleep in their RV, when all of a sudden, someone was pounding at the door. When the couple got up from the noise, they approached the door and the man could be heard screaming, "This is the police! You need to move your RV. You cannot park here." When Jackie went to open the door to greet this man, he then pointed 2 guns at her. He then uttered the phrase, "First, I'm going to rob you, and then I'm going to kill you." He demanded Jackie's jewelry, he demanded the wallets, Jackie's purse, anything of value. After they surrendered their valuables out of nowhere, the man then shoots Jackie and kills her instantly. Gordon manages to jump out of the RV and roll under it, avoiding the gunshots that were going his direction. Shortly after the commotion had ended, a 29-year-old man by the name of Brian Major pulled into the rest stop. This is when he saw the assailant, and Gordon can hear Brian say to the man, "Do you need help?" before he noticed he had 2 guns in his hands. Brian put his car into reverse and tried to flee, but it didn't work. The assailant fired shots into the car, killing Brian instantly. Gordon would survive the ordeal. He would give a description of the man, and this is a utterly terrifying computerized composite drawing of the assailant, who, to this very day in 2021, has still never been caught or identified. In 1999, police would investigate Ronald West, another murderer, who was actually at that point serving time for committing 2 other murders. At the time of the murders, he lived 12 miles away. He owned the types of guns that were used. He even used to be a police officer. The Blind River Killer identified himself as a cop. He even owned a blue van, which the Blind River Killer reportedly drove, but no physical evidence connects him. Gordon died in 2014, and this case is still unsolved. Dressed as the dead for Halloween night would become far too much of a reality for one Canadian citizen. Hello, true crimerers. This is another deadly Halloween. Viewer discretion is advised. This was 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest from Armstrong, British Columbia in Canada. On Halloween night 2011, she and her friends were really excited to go trick-or-treating for the last time before they became too old to do it. She would be dressed as a zombie that night. I think in 2011, zombies were a very popular costume idea. So she would leave her house in the early evening hours, and as she was leaving, she was constantly in contact with her friends through text. The walk to her friend's house would take her down some railroad tracks. It was secluded, it was dark. The last text message that she had sent to one of her friends was that she was being creeped, and then they never heard from her again. It was only 10 minutes into Taylor's walk when the text messages suddenly stopped. And when she didn't show up to her friend's house, the concern grew. Her family was alerted, and so she was presumed missing. So a massive search began, especially along the trail she would have been walking. And about 2.5 hours into the search, they would find Taylor. She was found alive alongside the train tracks, but she was unconscious and she was horribly beaten. She was hanging on by a thread. Unfortunately, several hours later in the morning, she would die in the hospital. Taylor had been strangled, and she also had been beaten over the head several times. She never woke up after they found her, so she was never able to identify her attacker. The coroner would report that she definitely fought her attacker. They actually found scratches along her own neck that came from her as she was trying to pull his hands off. She also got her attacker's DNA under her own nails. There were people who heard screams in that area, but again, it's Halloween night, screams are normal. Someone claimed to have seen a man running from the area and lurking around the area, and they described him looking like this. In April of 2012, they would get a DNA match from the skin cells. It matched a 26-year-old man named Matthew Forrester, who had been in that town that night on Halloween looking for sex. He says he followed Taylor that night down the train tracks until the area was dark enough. He then claimed he was looking for consensual sex from a stranger. When she resisted, he said that she fell over on her own accord and hit her head on a loose pipe. But the evidence of a fight would prove his story wrong. He did also sexually assault her. He was convicted in 2014 but got a new trial due to a jury issue. He then pled guilty to second-degree murder and got 17 years to life. Hi! Hello, scarers! Tonight I'm going to tell you the story of some Halloween home invasions. And messing around in the background will just be some creepy images. Aw, it's Dobby back when he was a thug. In Farmingdale, New York, Halloween night 2014. At around 8:45 p.m., a 34-year-old woman, she opened her door because someone was knocking. And at the door was 3 masked men. 2 of them were holding handguns. They forced their way in. What the f*** is that? Anyway, they demanded money. They then pistol whipped the woman and her husband. They then bound their wrists with duct tape, ransacked their home, and then escaped. And they were never caught. Story number 2. In Helena, West Helena, Arkansas, Halloween night 2015. 4 adult men knocked on the door and said, "Trick or treat!" And a little old lady opened the door. She immediately had a shotgun put to her face. Her elderly husband was sitting in a chair in the living room half asleep, when then he woke up to guns in his face. He was like, "Nah, motherfucker." He had a gun himself, then he fired it into the ceiling, and it scared them all away. They even dropped some of their guns. Nice! Story number 3. Halloween night 2013, Seattle, Washington. 3 men wearing Grim Reaper costumes and armed with guns would reveal themselves through the peephole of someone's home. They had guns, of course, but no one got hurt, but a whole bunch of jewelry and a whole bunch of cash was stolen. Oh my god. Halloween night 2019, Orinda, California. A woman rented out an Airbnb under the false pretense that her asthmatic family members needed to escape the fires that were happening. Instead, she threw a massive Halloween party. On that fateful Halloween night, there were roughly 100 people inside the Airbnb, when all of a sudden, gunshots rang out. Everyone in the house began to run and scream. Chaos erupted. When the dust settled, 5 people were murdered. I don't know if it was a partygoer or someone random. Warning, the graphic images you are about to see are not of people in actual distress, but instead are people willingly participating in the world's scariest haunted house attraction. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, scarers! This is the haunted house attraction called McKamey Manor, and it was located in Rancho Penasquitos, which is in the San Diego, California area. There are other versions of this house, like in Tennessee, but this is the original version. It was founded by this fellow in the blue shirt, Russ McKamey. He spent $500,000 renovating this home and turned it into a maze and, quite honestly, a torture tour. So it's extreme. You actually don't pay money to get in, you pay them 4 cans of dog food because they also rescue dogs. This is an image of people signing the 40-page waiver as 4 people in costume pretend to kidnap them. This is one of those haunted houses where the people can touch you. They put duct tape around your mouth. They'll duct tape your arms together. And they will literally simulate an actual kidnapping. Again, this is fake, TikTok. It says acting, it's not real. Now, Russ basically scripts this whole process. Most of his work is behind the scenes, directing all of this. The people who do this know exactly what they're getting into. This tour can last up to 8 hours, but from what I understand, a majority of people couldn't last more than 2. But they push you into all sorts of contraptions to scare the living daylights out of you. They have actually bound people, dumped fake blood all over them, and it's still like a maze. You have to go through like this maze around the house while trying to essentially escape these 4 kidnappers. They'll catch you and they'll put you in a freezer full of blood. You're goddamn right I would not do this. My fat ass would have heart failure. Oh, they get up close and personal with you. Aw, they're in love. Stop it. Now, you must be over the age of 21 to participate. You have to get cleared by your doctor first and bring them proof that you are allowed to do this. Oh, hell no. Those are actual snakes. There was a situation where one person did have a heart attack doing this, but I need to stress, you know about everything ahead of time. You have to get cleared by your doctor. This attraction with their 40-page waiver is completely protected. as it should be. Again, you volunteer for this madness. They can physically assault you, to a degree. They force you to eat and drink unknown things. And holy shit. Holy titty. And they psychologically torture you too, no shit. I don't know if it's still operating today though. But would you guys do this? Nope.
Scarerers. Let's start a new series about Halloween mysteries.
Ugh, got enough of that shit. Here's a kooky one. On Halloween Day in 1988, a 29-year-old stock market analyst would vanish. His name was David Lawrence Stone, and he was from La Jolla, California. He was really into that new age using spirit guides and whatnot. Well, on October 28th, 1988, his zen was apparently depleted. He threw a shindig at his apartment, but then he started getting into a fight with his friend, where David would begin to just punch his friend repeatedly. It was described as a very violent attack, and out of character for David. So David said, I'm gonna go on a walkabout. I'll go on a drive-about. I ain't gonna go walk around, you crazy ass. He told his friends and his family he'd be back in a couple of days. He just needed to find himself. A couple days later, on Halloween, he would walk into a desert 145 miles east of Tucson, Arizona, where a couple of farmers spotted him, but then he was gone. Sorry. Later on, investigators would question that farmer. The farmer said David told him he was out there searching for the beast. Other witnesses who claimed to see him from afar said David was acting very bizarre. He was talking to himself. He was using his arms to gesture at things. But there was no one in front of him or anywhere even near him. 5 days later, his vehicle would be found. It was left on the side of a New Mexico highway. And that wasn't the only weird thing. David left clues. A little bit northwest of where his car was, they saw a little pyramid made of rocks with a drawn triangle around it. David was really into this idea of vision quests, and apparently this is symbolic in that. His car was parked next to pyramid-type mountains. They searched a little farther the next day, and they found another pile of rocks. 3 miles north of that, they found written in the sand a string of numbers, which they would discover is the Fibonacci sequence, a sequence that stock market analysts use a lot. The sequence is supposed to end in 21, but his ended in 18. His car was parked next to mile marker 18. Investigators thought this was a clue, or some sort of distress message. They then found David's Rolex watch next to 2 quarters. David was never found alive. His skeletal remains were found 2 years later. No known cause of death.
'Tis the season to have the scared out of you. Anyway, hello true crimerers. I figured it's October. It's spooky season. Halloween's around the corner. So I thought I would cover or talk about 5 true crime cases that scare me. So this video is 5 of the scariest true crime cases that scares Mike. Viewer discretion is advised. Number 15. I'm kidding. Oh my god, could you imagine? I'm not going to do that to you guys. But number 5, the Robeson family murders. It was July 22nd, 1968, in the little community of Goodhart, Michigan. One cabin resident would tell the caretaker of the area there was a really horrific odor coming from one of the nearby cabins. Chauncey Bliss, who was the caretaker, would go out to check on this smell. So he goes out to the cabin in question, knocks on the door, nobody answers. The last time he knew, the Robeson family was staying in that cabin at that time. Now, no one had seen the Robesons for a few weeks. They had been there since the end of June or so, but they did tell people that they were going to be traveling down to Florida and some other place to purchase some property. So it wasn't completely confusing or suspicious that they were not answering the door. But when the caretaker approached the house, it was very evident something really horrific smell coming from that house. The doors of the cabin were locked. He didn't have the set of keys on him, and so thinking something was wrong, he took an instrument and he pried open the door. And when he did, he came across a scene from a horror movie. 6 bodies inside that house, all in a state of decay. There was congealed and dried blood all over the floor, blood spatter all over the walls. And he recognized the first body he saw was Shirley Robeson, the matriarch of the family. So the caretaker runs out of the house and he immediately goes to get to a phone to call the police. The police arrive. The bodies are found in a couple different locations. There's 3 bodies piled up sort of in a hallway or entryway. And there's one body kind of between a bedroom and the hallway, and then one in the bedroom directly. 42-year-old Richard Robeson and his 7-year-old daughter, her name was Susan, both of them had been shot to death, but it was also evident that they had both been bludgeoned over the head several times with a hammer, and I believe the hammer was found at the scene. Other 4 bodies, including 40-year-old Shirley, 19-year-old Richie, 16-year-old Gary, and 12-year-old Randy, they had all been shot to death. And they had been shot based on ammunition that they found at the scene. They had been shot with a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. There was no forced entry in the house, no broken windows, no kicked in doors, nothing of that nature. So they think that either the killer was let in the house by someone in this family, maybe someone they knew, or the killer was able to enter the house through an unlocked door. They really couldn't confirm if the family kept the doors locked or unlocked at all times. There really wasn't much forensic evidence left behind that would help police. I mean, this is in 1968. This is before modern technology really existed, where we could get skin cell DNA from things and all that. And so when they don't know about these things, a lot of times they don't collect evidence back then the proper way that we would now. But they did have like the shell casings. They dusted the cabin for fingerprints, for everything like that, but they really didn't come up with anything from that. Police from the get-go really believed that Richard Robeson was probably the primary target of this. Richard was the breadwinner of the family. He was a successful executive. He owned his own business, made a lot of money. But then it really kind of made them wonder, like, okay, if they're going to kill Richard, why kill everybody else? But again, they might have been witnesses. But as they look further into Richard's business dealings, they realize that he was not doing as well as he may have claimed he was. His business, his company, was beginning to get in trouble. Like, they were losing money. While the family was going to be in Goodhart on this vacation at this cabin, he left the business in the hands of one of his employees, a 30-year-old named Joseph Scalaro III. And then what police would find out after this investigation got started was that Joseph Scalaro had been embezzling money from this company. They don't really know if Richard truly knew that or not, but they did find phone records that Joseph and Richard had a conversation on June 25th, 1968, and that call would go to that cabin where the family was found, because they had been there starting at like the late June, and they do know that the family was there on June 25th because Richard had interacted with the caretaker on June 25th. But a phone call came in. They determined it came from Joseph. And so what police theorize is that Richard may have found out about the embezzling while he was on vacation. And maybe he confronted Joseph over the phone and said, hey, listen, I'm going to the police about this when I get back. Perhaps. And so maybe that prompted Joseph to go, well, guess I'm going to go out there and kill him and his family. It's a possibility. When they looked into Joseph's alibi, they found out that his family, his friends, for a good 12-hour portion of that day on June 25th, nobody knew where Joseph was. And another thing they found was that so Joseph would go to the shooting range, and apparently in one of the areas he was shooting, police collected the shell casings from that, and it matched shell casings found at the murder scene. It's circumstantial because it was just shell casings. It wasn't, they couldn't like do the whole line up under a microscope thing, and like match up the little grooves. So it was inconclusive for the most part. But there were no witnesses who could place Joseph Scalaro in good heart at the time of the murder. There were no witnesses who saw or heard anything when the murders would have happened. There was no actual genuine evidence linking Joseph to this murder. They had circumstantial evidence at best. They had a possible motive, but it doesn't mean he actually did it. So Emmett County, which is where murders took place, the prosecutor said, I don't have enough evidence to go forward with an indictment or to charge Joseph Scalaro with anything. But then the Oakland County prosecutor, which is where the family was from, they said, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot. These people lived in my area. Let's try it. And it worked. He was able to press charges against Joseph Scalaro. But before they could arrest him, Joseph must have caught wind of it, because as they got to his home to arrest him, he was dead. He had shot himself in the head. He left behind a suicide note that read, I am a liar, a cheat, a phony, but I am not a killer. I am scared and sick. Implying in his note that he wasn't the one responsible for the murders. But why did he kill himself if he knew police were about to arrest him? Did he maybe think, well, there's going to be no hope, I have no chance of getting away with this, even though I didn't do it? Maybe. Maybe he didn't want to deal with being falsely imprisoned or falsely accused, and he killed himself. Or maybe he did do it, and he just killed himself because of that. But to this very day, the murders of the Robison family remains unsolved. Number 4, the disappearance of Angela Hammond. Angela Hammond was a 20-year-old young woman living in Clinton, Missouri. Angela was very popular. She was friendly. Everybody loved her. Very charming personality. She was attending Central Missouri State University, and she was engaged to a man named Rob Schaefer. They had from what it sounds like, a really good relationship. It was April 4th, 1991 at approximately 10 p.m. Angela had dropped her fiance Rob off at his house because they had just gone to a barbecue, and then Rob had to go back to the house to babysit his brother because his mom was working like a late night shift, I guess. And then at 11:15 p.m., Rob, who is now at home, his mom had just gotten home, and he gets a phone call from Angela, and she is at a payphone. This is at the intersection of Jefferson and 2nd Street. While she was on the phone with Rob, and this is where the creepy aspect comes in, she says she's telling him on the phone, some creepy guy just pulled up in this green pickup truck right next to me in the phone booth. It was eerie because it's a dark parking lot. There's no one else there. She didn't really know why this guy had to pull up and park right next to the phone booth. The man gets out of the truck. He kind of walks around his truck, and Angela's just describing him to Rob over the phone, describing his truck to him. And then the guy gets back into his truck for like a minute, and then he gets out of the truck, according to Angela. He now has a flashlight, and he's looking around his truck. And he kind of seems to be lingering around the phone. And Rob can hear Angela ask the man, do you need to use the phone? He says no. And then Angela and Rob continue on with their conversation. And then all of a sudden, Rob hears Angela scream. A chilling, terrifying scream. And then Rob hears a man say, quote, I didn't need to use the phone anyway. Now, Rob knew where she was, and so he immediately drops his phone, gets into his vehicle, and he books it to that phone booth area. But as he is driving, he sees a green pickup truck driving super fast the opposite direction from the area of the payphone. He then hears these blood-curdling screams of a woman screaming for Rob's name. And so Rob sees this, and then he spins around, he flips a bitch, right? And he begins to chase after the truck. When he did this, apparently, he blew out the transmission, because I guess of how, I'm not really sure how that works, but the transmission blew out, and he ended up his car ended up stalling, and the guy in the truck with Angela got away. According to Angela's description, this was a green pickup truck, and it had this decal on the back window. It was like a fish jumping out of water type thing. And she described the man to Rob, who then Rob tells police the description, and they come up with this particular composite drawing of him. It's not exactly the greatest, but it's, he's relaying information that he heard from somebody else. There weren't really any other witnesses who can corroborate Rob's account of these, this truck speeding and him flipping around and, her screaming. No one else really could say they heard or saw that. So they give Rob a polygraph test and he passes it with flying colors. But then other witnesses would come forward to state that sometime just before Angela got into that parking lot, there were a couple of witnesses who did see a green pickup truck and a disheveled looking man coming out of that truck who was sort of lingering around those payphones, but then apparently he came back when Angela was there. Within a week of Angela's disappearance, Rob was completely cleared. They were able to find out that he had nothing to do with this. And then Angela's case goes cold. There's really no leads or tips. And it's so scary because she was on the phone conversating with her fiance and literally describing her eventual kidnapper and probable killer. And he heard her screaming. And he heard his voice saying, I didn't need to use the phone anyway. Then he saw the truck speeding away with his fiancée in it. And there was nothing he could do. In 2021 or so, police in Clinton would announce that there was a kind of a lead. Some informant had received a magazine cutout letter. And this letter read, Hello, no. We know who you are, no. People like you deserve what you get, and we know where your foxy daughter is. She will see us soon. Tell wife's name she has our deepest sympathy in her further loss. Goodbye. The letter, I guess, correctly identified the informant's court-issued number along with his estranged wife's first name. The letter was postmarked April 4th, 1991, the day of Angela's abduction. The informant's wife and daughter, who were also named Angela, were living in Clinton at the time. Police, like a year or so later, end up getting a phone call from an anonymous caller stating information about that cutout, magazine cutout letter. But whoever authored that letter, whoever put it together, they knew this informant because they knew the informant's wife. But why they were tying it in with this Angela Hammond thing, I'm not sure. They don't really even know for sure if the letter had anything to do with Angela Hammond's disappearance or if it was just some sort of stupid joke or hoax. Anonymous caller, they were never able to trace that number, and that person never called back. And to this day, the disappearance of Angela Hammond remains unsolved. Number 3, the Blind River murders. I watched this case on Unsolved Mysteries when I was younger, and this case, for whatever reason, was the one to scare me more than any other murder case ever talked about on that show. I don't know why. It's just so terrifying to me. It was June of 1991. 62-year-old Gordon McAllister and his 59-year-old wife Jacqueline, they were on a trip. They were originally from Lindsay, Ontario in Canada, and their trip was to take their RV and go across Canada. They had been married for about 39 years. It was during the first leg of their trip. They had been driving for some time, and they decided we need to finally pull off the road and get some sleep. It was the middle of the night on June 28th, 1991. They pulled into the Blind River rest stop. There was nobody else in the parking area. That was not a single soul in sight. So they parked their RV, locked their door, and they lay down for bed. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, they hear a knock on the camper door. And that's, I think, one of the things that scares. It's just like you're sleeping in a rest stop in your RV, and you hear a rap at your door from no one knows you're there, and so it's just so creepy. And so Jacqueline, she wakes up and she opens the door, and immediately she is bum rushed back inside the RV by this man with like this long blonde hair, looks like a wig, and he's armed with 2 guns. At that point, Gordon wakes up and he begins to like, hey, you need to get out of here, Guy's like, I'm gonna rob you. I'm here, give me all your jewelry, all your money. And Jackie is like, okay, we're gonna comply. He points the guns at them and says, first, I'm going to rob you, and then I am going to kill you. They get all of their valuables together. They hand it over to the man. And they're begging to him, we're not going to tell anyone about this. We swear. We won't say a thing. We'll just leave. Jackie is now pleading for her life. And he just lifts the gun as she's begging for her life and shoots her directly in her chest, killing her instantly. Gordon tries to run, but then the guy lifts the gun and shoots towards him. He shoots Gordon, I guess, somewhere in his back. And Gordon's able to escape out one of the door of the RV. And then he rolls under the RV before the assailant was able to get out. As this assailant is now walking out of the RV, someone begins to drive and pull into the rest stop. This man would turn out to be 29-year-old Brian Donald Major. Brian Major saw this man carrying two guns, and because he's getting out of his car when he notices this, and the assailant approaches him and says, "Is there a problem?" And then like, "No, there's no problem, not at all." Like, hastily, kind of like he sees what's happening here, and like he tries to get back into his car. But all of a sudden, the assailant goes in front of Brian's car, and as Brian's trying to start his car to take off, the guy, shoots Brian right through the windshield and kills him. Meanwhile, Gordon, who's been shot, is lying underneath the RV, hoping the assailant doesn't notice. And luckily, he doesn't. And so the assailant gets into a van and speeds off. Witnesses would later tell police that they did, in fact, see like this big blue van kind of driving through multiple lanes, like super fast speeds. About a week or so after the murders happened, police would release a pretty terrifying composite image. This was a computer-generated image that they were using their, I guess, newfounded computer technology to do this. And this is one of the most realistic, human-looking composites I've ever seen. But at the same time, it is horrifying. The image of this man, who is the supposed killer, is just... It gave me nightmares when I was a kid. Gordon was at one point, talked about and looked at as a possible suspect, but they were to rule him out. I mean, he was shot in the back. They know he didn't do this. In June of 1995, a man named Ronald Glenn West was listed as a possible suspect in this case. Ronald was a former police officer. The thing is that when this assailant knocked on the RV door, he identified himself as a police officer, which, at that time, it turns out he wasn't. Well, in 1995, he had been charged with multiple different armed robberies, and he was sentenced to about 10 years in prison for those. In 1999, he was then charged with 2 murders, and these are murders dating back to the 1970s. And the reason why he came up on the radar for the Blind River murders is because his ex-wife would say that, one, he owned a big blue van, like was seen speeding away from the crime scene. He owned a .22 caliber rifle, which is what one of the weapons was used in the case, in the murder. And then the other thing is that he actually owned a blonde wig, that's kind of like a whoa moment, because the guy who did this, according to Gordon, it very much looked like the guy was wearing a blonde wig. It did not look like his actual hair. Ronald Glenn West was convicted of the 2 murders from the 70s and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 2012, Gordon passes away. Ronald West has never been charged or indicted with the Blind River murders. They don't have the physical evidence to say for sure that he is their guy. It sounds like him, former police officer, posed as a police officer. He had the wig, he had the gun, same type of van. You think it all kind of clicks, but you do still need the evidence. And so, unfortunately, the Blind River murders case has remained unsolved. Number 2, Elisa Lam. I know a lot of you are very familiar with the Elisa Lam case, and if you have seen the Netflix documentary about her case, you pretty much know or have an idea of what the actual solution in this case ended up being. But there is still a lot of people out there who very much doubt what the Netflix docuseries said. Elisa Lam was a student at the University of British Columbia, and in 2013, she was taking a trip through California. Elisa traveled alone. She was by herself. She had gone to San Diego. She went to the San Diego Zoo. She then arrived in Los Angeles on January 26th. She checked into the Cecil Hotel about 2 days after she arrived in Los Angeles. And Elisa was given a shared room with like other college-aged girls. But apparently the roommates there started to complain about Elisa having this very strange and erratic, odd behavior. Elisa was diagnosed as bipolar, and there are some reports that say that Elisa sometimes did not take her bipolar medication. And the roommates would state that Elisa was leaving them notes that said, like, go away, go home, get out of here. And she was just being very bizarre. She would then go to a live taping of the Conan show, and I guess she was escorted off of the set because of erratic behavior. With the situation with the roommates, the hotel basically put Elisa in her own room. On January 31st, 2013, she was supposed to check out that day. And she was supposed to call her parents on that day when she was checking out of the hotel, but she never did. And so after a brief time, they would contact the Los Angeles Police Department to report her missing because they had never heard from her again. So once they found out that she was at the Cecil Hotel, they did a thorough search, they said, of the hotel. They went room to room. There was only so much they could legally do in terms of searching. They couldn't just go into every person's room without permission. On February 13th, police would release the now very famous elevator footage. So what you're about to see is a segment kind of edited, just for time, of the elevator footage that was captured. So for about 2.5, 3 minutes or so, Elisa is seen with some very strange behavior in this elevator. She kind of pops in, and then she begins to press like every button, and then at one point she like hides against a wall as if she's hiding from someone. And at one point kind of hops out like she's playing hide and go seek or trying to scare someone, right? So then gets back in. And then at one point, in one of the more unsettling parts, she is outside the elevator and it looks like she's talking to someone. You don't ever see any other person, not once. You don't see anyone other than her ever. But then she's doing these weird like hand movements, right? Like it's just so bizarre. It's so unsettling. But then she kind of walks off of frame and that's it. You never see her again. It was February 19th when the hotel became aware of some disturbing information. The faucets were beginning to put out really dark, kind of brownish water, very disgusting looking water. And they have a maintenance guy go up to the roof to check on the big water tanks they have up on the roof. And once he looks in one of these tanks, he sees Elisa Lam. She's lying nude, face up in the water. Her clothing is also in there. And it was the same clothes that she had been wearing in that elevator footage. And that means that the water that was running through the hotel was water with her decayed body in it. The autopsy would show no signs of any physical trauma. So no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no, blunt force trauma, nothing. There was no indication that she did anything to herself in terms of suicide. No ligature marks, no cuts on her wrists or anywhere. She had a very small amount of alcohol, like below the legal limit, in her system. There were no recreational drugs in her system, and there was a small amount of her prescription drugs in her system. But it was not even at the levels that she was prescribed to take, so she was under-medicating. Ultimately, her cause of death was labeled as accidental drowning. The big mystery was, how did Elisa get into that tank? How did she even get onto the roof? Because apparently you needed roof access. You needed a key card or keys to get up there. And only staff has access to those ways of getting onto the roof. So at one point they're like, well, did someone in the staff do something to her? Is that who she was talking to in that elevator footage? They also found out that the hotel's fire escapes could actually basically get someone to the roof of the building and bypass all of the security measures to get up there. It was possible. When this story initially came out, the story that we were told was that when the body was found, the lid was closed. The whole thing was closed, which is what made it such a big mystery, was that there would have been no way that Elisa would have been able to close the lid back on herself because where she was at in terms of the water level in the tank, there would have been no way she could have physically put it back down. That's what we believed, right? But the actual truth is that when the maintenance man went up there, the tank lid was open already. And that's about it. I mean, it's just now been ruled accidental drowning. But it really, the question still remains as to why, how did she get up to that roof? Did she use the fire escape? There's no video of that. No one saw her doing it. How did she know to climb this ladder to get to the lid of this tank? And how did she open it? How did she climb into it? And she got all of her clothes off, in there. How did she drown? She knew how to swim. So it's like, how did she drown in that water? Maybe after some time, she got tired of waiting and she drowned. I'm not sure. There were no illicit drugs in her system. She had a very small amount of alcohol, not enough that would say like, oh my, okay, she was like shit-faced drunk. She wasn't. Her own prescription medications were less than what she should have been taking. So it's not like she was inebriated that caused this to happen. It's strange. The circumstances of how and why Elisa Lam got into that tank is still a mystery. Well, all they really know is that she got into that tank somehow. And it doesn't really answer the question of, did somebody put her in that tank? It's possible, but she died of drowning. So did they force her under the water somehow? How would they have done that? But also, if she was in there just by herself, how did she drown? It's strange. It's unsettling, it's creepy. But really, it's an elevator footage that was taken probably moments before her death that just really makes this case so scary. Because you either see a woman who's communicating with someone off camera, that's someone who's never come forward, or she's talking to a ghost, right? Some people think she's talking because the Cecil Hotel is a pretty shady place with a history. Some people say like, oh, maybe she was seeing ghosts, right? Or you're looking at a woman who was under-medicating herself for bipolar disorder, who was going through a rough patch, who may have been mentally unstable at that time and was maybe hallucinating, maybe something. She was unwell, and you see that in full effect on camera. And then she ends up in a tank, dead. How she got there, though, is a mystery. Why she was in there, a mystery. And while how she died has been solved, really why she died and the circumstances behind her death still very much remain unsolved. Number 1, the Ketty Cabin Murders. It was April 11th, 1981, in the area of Ketty, California. Sue Sharp and her 5 children had recently moved down to this area after she had separated from her husband in 1979. They moved to the Northern California area because that's where Sue's brother lived. She and the kids were originally from Connecticut. And they were staying in cabin number 28. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning on April 12th, 1981, Sue's daughter Sheila arrives back at cabin number 28. And when she enters the cabin, she sees a nightmare. She finds the body of her mother Sue, her brother John, and John's friend Dana. Her sister Tina, who was supposed to be in the cabin, was missing. The 3 youngest kids who were in the cabin that night, Rick, Greg, and Justin, were in their bedroom asleep, but alive. They were left unharmed. Sue, John, and Dana had been brutally murdered. They were bludgeoned to death with hammers. They had all been bound with medical tape and electrical cords. There were 2 bloody knives found at the scene, hammers, and they were covered in blood. The knives were like, one of them was bent. It was used so forcefully that the knife bent. Sheila, one of the daughters, had been staying at a nearby cabin with some friends and was close by to where, she had lived. But nobody heard any screams that night. Nobody heard altercations. Nobody heard a thing. But then there was a couple who cabin number 16 that said sometime around 1:15 a.m. they think they heard the sound of some muffled screams coming from somewhere. Could that have been the murders? It's possible, but they don't really know for sure. There was no forced entry in the cabin. There was also, according to police, no known motive. Nothing was stolen. Sue wasn't sexually assaulted. It was an incredibly bloody scene. There was just blood everywhere. It was such a violent attack. One of the most confusing aspects of this case is the fact that 3 young children left alive inside the cabin. And the 3 kids, it seems like they slept through this entire thing. So Justin, who was one of the boys, was actually a friend of Ricky and Greg, but he was sleeping over that night. While Ricky and Greg don't claim they saw anything, Justin Smart says he thought he saw Sue with 2 men, and they both wore glasses, and they would end up coming up with these composite drawings of those 2 men based on his description. He said one of the men had a hammer in his hand. Justin says that he thinks John and Dana came into the cabin that night and got into an argument with these 2 unknown men, and then a violent fight happened from it. And then apparently Tina, the one of the youngest daughters, was just kidnapped and taken out of the cabin because Tina wasn't found in the cabin. She was supposed to be there, but she wasn't there. In terms of suspects, the police really said they had 2 viable suspects. One of them was Justin Smart's dad, and his name was Martin Smart. And then Martin Smart's friend and house guest named John Bobady. These were 2 men who had connections with organized crime. And it was actually organized crime that investigated these murders and not homicide, which was also very strange. Both men had been seen in a bar the night of the murder acting very, very strange. Martin Smart would tell police that he owned a hammer that suddenly somehow went missing from his garage. But not much really came from that investigation into these 2 suspects, at least not at that time. 3 years after the triple murder, it now became a quadruple homicide. A human skull had been found about 30 miles away from where the murders happened. This human skull would later be identified as Tina Sharp. The case from the get-go was considered to be horribly investigated. It was a botched investigation. It almost felt like the police were deliberately not trying to solve it. Like when they would reopen this case around 2013 or so as a cold case unit with brand new people on the case, they found evidence that clearly had never been looked at or touched by the initial investigators. And they found out in this cold case unit that Marty Smart's wife had actually left Marty the day of the bodies being found. And then later, she got a handwritten note from Marty, and the note read, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want?" Now, this letter was given to police shortly after the murders happened. However, it was never looked at as a confession. It was never treated as a confession. It was never really looked at as evidence at all. And in 2008, when Marilyn, who was Marty's wife at the time, was interviewed, she said she fully believes that her husband and his friend Bo were responsible for this quadruple homicide. But then the sheriff, or the detective, whatever, who was initially investigating the Ketty Cabin murders, said that he refuted this because he said, well, they both passed polygraph tests back in the initial part of this investigation, so they were cleared. Because we all know polygraph tests are completely accurate, right? Well, it turns out that Marty was actually buds with the investigating detective. They were close. One of the cold case detectives in 2016 met with a counselor who wanted to remain anonymous. I guess this was a counselor to Martin Smart, who back in May of 1981 allegedly Marty confessed to this counselor in 1981 about the murders. So this counselor told case detective that Marty said, quote, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." The counselor tried to tell the Department of Justice about this confession back in 1981. They said, sorry, we're not doing anything with that. And they dismissed it as being hearsay. In 2016, a very rusted hammer was found at the bottom of a lake, and it's believed that this was one of the murder weapons. They did find a couple of the murder weapons at the house, but many instruments were used, hammers and knives. And so they believe that this other hammer they found would have been really close to where Cabin 28 was. It had since been demolished, Cabin 28, but they believe that hammer was a part of the crime. One of the biggest theories is that there was some kind of love triangle, that Marty and Sue were having some kind of affair. There was also a rumor that Sue Sharp had been trying to tell Marilyn, Marty's wife at the time, had been trying to convince her to leave Marty, and Marty supposedly found out that Sue was doing that, and Marty flipped his shit. And so he enlisted the help of Bo, his good buddy, to help carry out these murders. And that the plan was to only kill Sue, but what they didn't account for was that there were going to be other people in the cabin that night. And so whoever was there who physically would witness these people coming into the house had to be killed too. Allegedly, all because Sue was trying to tell Marilyn to leave her husband. Even though in this theory, Marty and Sue are having an affair. It's bizarre. But it does explain why the three boys were left unharmed, because one of the boys in that bedroom was Marty Smart's own child. It also does kind of make sense as to why Marilyn would end up leaving her husband the day the bodies were found. And it does explain the context of that note, like, look what you've made me do, I've killed 4 people. The cold case team would kind of unearth some, like, possibilities that Bo and Marty were involved in some kind of drug smuggling scheme. The Department of Justice was involved, and that the sheriff was on the take, and all of this stuff, like the police were deliberately covering up this crime because Marty and Bo were drug dealers connected to crime syndicates, and they were looped in with the police. It's very possible that that's actually what the case was. And it does explain why they sent organized crime people to investigate this murder, not homicide. They knew from the get-go who was responsible, and they needed to cover it up. But the new cold case team is still very much actively working on this case. However, if Marty Smart and Bo Bobady are responsible for the murders, they got away with it. Both of them have since died. They are really the only 2 actual suspects in this case. All they know is that at least one person, more than likely 2, entered the Cabin 28 that night and brutally murdered 4 people. Well, murdered 3 people, and then for some reason kidnapped the young girl and killed her at a different time and location. And that's one of the things that people don't seem to understand why that occurred. Why wasn't she just killed in the cabin that night? Why was she taken? Was there a second kind of like, oh, okay, I'm going to take this little girl since she's here, and we're going to have our way with her, and then we'll kill her? That's possible. And while if those 2 are the killers, they will never face justice, there is still a chance that they could get some of the people who were involved in the cover-up. If they can get proof of it, they can make it happen. They can arrest the appropriate people. Because if it was those 2 men, they should have been arrested, charged, and convicted of this murder, or at least gone to a trial. And the fact that nobody else was looked at, It kind of signifies that these two men must have been responsible for it, but they don't really know that 100% for sure. And they never really will, unless they have some kind of confession from the players involved. It is also possible that a completely different person entered the cabin that night and did this horrible crime. But here we are in 2024, and the Ketty cabin murders still officially remain unsolved. So those are 5 true crime cases that I've always found creepy. I think it's a lot to do with like people entering a home in the middle of the night kind of thing, but I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Have you heard about these cases? Do you think they're scary? Do they creep you out? But yeah. Anyway, that's it for today's video. So we'll see you. We'll see you for whenever I put up the next one. I'm not sure when that'll be, but it'll be at some point. So until then, ta-ta for now. True crime, Arunish.